Hi guys, tonight the materialization of peace. The suburb itself was an architectural manifestation of the era's values. Conformity was king. Each house, though nominally different, followed a strict, unspoken code of uniformity. This predictability was comforting. It meant safety. It meant that every neighbor was operating by the same set of rules, the most important of which was maintaining the illusion of effortless perfection. The houses, built quickly and efficiently, were constructed with a psychological purpose, to foster a sense of shared aspiration. The identical aluminum siding and symmetrical window boxes did more than just house families, they housed an ideology. For Eleanor Atherton, surveying Pine Knoll Heights from her freshly poured concrete patio, the security was palpable, a physical weight lifted from her chest. Her childhood had been shadowed by bread lines and her young adulthood by blackout drills. Her husband, George, had seen the worst of humanity across the Atlantic. This home was their shield, their bunker against chaos. And if the price of that shield was a rigid adherence to domestic and aesthetic perfection, Eleanor felt ready to pay it. George, a structural engineer, arrived home promptly at 5:30 p.m., the sound of his Buick's tires crunching on the gravel driveway signaling the end of her solitary day. Eleanor made sure she met him at the door looking less like a domestic laborer and more like a greeting card illustration. She had precisely 15 minutes between stirring the beef stroganoff and his arrival to complete her transformation. She rushed to the hall mirror, the remnants of the day's toil, a faint smudge of grime from wrestling with the coal chute, a stray wisp of hair escaping her chignon, erased with frantic efficiency. She touched up the perfect shell-pink curve of her lipstick, checked the set of her freshly ironed shirtwaist dress, and most crucially, clipped the pearl stud earrings onto her lobes. The transformation was complete. The dutiful, hard-working homemaker was instantly replaced by the poised, serene wife. The appearance of tranquility, her mother-in-law had once instructed, is the single most important component of marital harmony, dear. Let him see peace when he walks in the door. When George kissed her, a quick, proprietary peck, he didn't see the woman who had spent 5 hours scrubbing stubborn wax from the kitchen floor, or the nervous exhaustion clouding her eyes. He saw the finished product, a vision of domestic order that affirmed his own success in providing it. "Smells wonderful, Elle," he murmured, shedding his suit jacket. "How was your day? Everything in order?" "Perfectly in order, darling," she replied, her voice smooth and devoid of any hint of strain. The gospel of grooming. The pressure to maintain this perfectly in order status extended far beyond the immediate presence of her husband. It was dictated by the arbiters of post-war culture, the women's magazines. Publications like Ladies' Home Journal and Good Housekeeping weren't just reading material, they were sacred texts, detailing the minute requirements of the modern, successful woman. Eleanor's coffee table was always laid out with the latest issue, not only for show, but as a constant refresher course. The magazines offered a unified, unwavering vision. A woman's beauty was a direct measure of her self-respect and her respect for her family. "The well-groomed wife," one editorial advised, "is the best investment a man can make." This wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about performance. Eleanor learned that a perfect home required a perfect hostess, and a perfect hostess required relentless maintenance. Her beauty regimen was a complex, multi-layered operation that began before the children woke and didn't truly end until the lights went out. The hair, for example, could not simply be clean. It had to be set. Every Tuesday, Eleanor submitted to the painful process of wrapping her hair around prickly plastic rollers, securing them with bobby pins, and sleeping on the uncomfortable hardness beneath a hairnet. The goal was the signature bouffant, or soft, controlled wave, a look that suggested endless leisure despite being achieved through hours of disciplined effort. The resulting hairdo, stiff with setting lotion, was a sculptural work that had to remain intact for the next 6 days, only to be carefully brushed and preserved each night. Then there was the makeup. It was considered vulgar to look unmade, but equally vulgar to look overly made. The perfect face was a canvas of carefully blended natural tones, a light, matte foundation to mask any imperfections, which were themselves moral failings, a subtle trace of eyeliner to enhance the eyes, and of course, the vibrant yet demurely applied lipstick. The lipstick, in a shade like Revlon's Fire and Ice, was not a tool of seduction, it was an emblem of polish, a final seal on the package. Eleanor's dresser drawers were a repository of these tools of the trade, thick jars of Pond's cold cream, tubes of Max Factor pancake, stiff boxes of false eyelashes she occasionally attempted, and always a bottle of Chanel No. 5, the scent of aspiration. Each item was a mandatory piece of the protective armor she wore against the world's judgment. The invisible labor. The greatest struggle, however, was the requirement that all this meticulous effort appear effortless. The perfect housewife was never tired, never sweaty, and never ever caught in a state of disarray. Eleanor often felt like a stage actress performing a continuous 7-day-a-week play. She would wake up at 5:30 a.m. not to dress, but to address the household's needs, turning on the percolator, setting the table, and laying out George's freshly pressed shirt. Only then, with the domestic front secured, could she attend to herself. She had to plan her daily activities around the dictates of her apparel. A spotless white apron was mandatory for cooking and cleaning, but the moment a neighbor might call, it had to be instantly whisked off to reveal the dress underneath. One couldn't be caught by Mrs. Henderson from across the street looking like a mere worker. She remembered a disastrous afternoon last spring when she had been elbow-deep in the garden, clad in an old pair of George's trousers and a ragged shirt. Mrs. Henderson had appeared with a plate of her infamous Jell-O mold. The look of subtle, pitying disapproval on Mrs. Henderson's face had stung more than any direct insult. "Oh dear, Eleanor, you look positively worn out. Such a shame for a lovely girl like you to let yourself go so. George is such a successful man, too." The implication was clear. Eleanor was failing in her duty to reflect her husband's status. She was letting the promise of the post-war world slip through her fingers simply by looking untidy for a single hour. That moment solidified a lesson Eleanor already knew. Her body and her appearance were not her own. They were public property, a social currency, and a guarantor of the neighborhood's moral and economic stability. The shame of being worn out was a deep moral stain. The inner retreat. Yet, beneath the stiff petticoats and the layer of foundation, a different woman persisted. The woman who had, briefly, during the war, worked as a filing clerk for a defense contractor and enjoyed the sharp intellectual satisfaction of her job. That woman, whose mind craved the structure of data and the satisfaction of a complete ledger, was now trapped in the loop of domestic ritual. She found her only refuge in the rare moments when George was out and the children were napping. She would go to the back of the house, where the sewing machine stood, and instead of mending socks, She would, sometimes, pull out the yellowed textbooks from her 2 semesters of college before the war interrupted everything. She would trace the complex algebraic equations with her finger, feeling a brief electric connection to the person she had almost become. But the fear of discovery was ever present. A wife who read difficult books or yearned for an identity outside the home was a threat to the suburban promise. Such desires were labeled as neuroses, as ungratefulness for the bounty of the era. The prescribed remedy for a restless mind was not intellectual fulfillment, but a new pair of gloves, a better recipe, or perhaps a trip to the beauty parlor for a deeper, tighter perm.
Eleanor knew she had to crush these rebellious thoughts beneath the weight of her duty. The suburban dream was a fragile ecosystem, and any deviation, a messy house, an unkempt appearance, and ambitious thought, could shatter the glass case of security they had built. The relentless demand for flawless beauty was the price of admission to this new, safe world. And as Eleanor prepared to host the neighborhood's monthly bridge club, applying another precise coat of lipstick, she understood that her silent struggle to be the perfect housewife was, in fact, the most profound struggle of the post-war era, a battle fought not with weapons, but with willpower and a bottle of lacquer. The coronation of the homemaker. If the post-war suburban move was the establishment of a new nation, a nation defined by white picket fences and 2-car garages, then the 1950s housewife was its crowned monarch. This was not the practical, rationing-minded matron of the Depression, nor the Rosie the Riveter figure of the war. This was a completely new archetype, meticulously crafted by advertising agencies, sociological texts, and the aspirational glow of television screens. Her title, Homemaker, conferred a sense of professional dignity, disguising the sheer volume of unpaid labor she performed. She was not merely a cook or a cleaner. She was the CEO of domestic bliss, the minister of morale, and the chief financial officer of household frugality. The home was her kingdom, and its flawless execution was the measure of her success, and by extension, her husband's. In Pine Cole Heights, this ideal was personified by Mrs. Evelyn Albright, Eleanor Atherton's neighbor, and the undisputed social queen of their cul-de-sac. Evelyn was the living, breathing embodiment of the magazine illustrations. Her silver hair, perfectly coiffed into a tight, symmetrical wave, never seemed to lose its shape, even on the hottest summer days. She wore her house dresses like couture, and her pearls seemed perpetually luminous. Evelyn's kitchen, which Eleanor had only seen on the pretense of borrowing a cup of sugar, was a shrine to modernity and efficiency. Every appliance gleamed. Every spice jar was alphabetized. Evelyn didn't just cook, she curated meals, using new, convenient boxed mixes, not out of laziness, but as a demonstration of her intelligent use of the latest American innovation. This was the core of the new ideal. The perfect housewife was simultaneously traditional in her devotion to family and aggressively modern in her embrace of technology. The tools of the throne. The true definition of the domestic queen rested on her mastery of consumer culture. After years of wartime scarcity, the American economy was booming, and the housewife was its engine. She was instructed to fulfill her duty to the nation not just by raising good citizens, but by buying the appliances, detergents, and frozen foods that kept the factories running. The magazines presented the kitchen as a laboratory of love. The refrigerator, gleaming white and immense, was a symbol of endless plenty and security. The washing machine liberated her from the scrubbing board, but paradoxically raised the standard of cleanliness to an impossible level. If she had a machine to wash clothes, there was now no excuse for a single stain. The vacuum cleaner, sleek and powerful, was not just a tool, it was a weapon against the dust motes that could compromise the family's health and the home's integrity. Eleanor, still reliant on her somewhat outdated stove and a cumbersome manual mixer, felt the sting of inadequacy every time she visited Evelyn's spotless domain. Evelyn didn't just own these appliances, she spoke of them with proprietary pride, detailing the superior spin cycle of her new Bendix washer or the precise temperature control of her hot point oven. "It's not just about the work, Eleanor," Evelyn once lectured, polishing an already pristine chrome faucet. "It's about making the effort invisible. A perfect home runs on its own. A perfect wife simply guides it. You must always look like you've been resting, not laboring." This notion, the invisibility of labor, was perhaps the most damaging tenet of the housewife ideal. She was expected to be perpetually busy, yet never appear rushed, disheveled, or fatigued. She had to cook a 3-course meal, iron her husband's shirts, drive the children to their activities, and still have the time to meticulously apply her makeup and change into a fresh outfit before George walked in the door. One evening, exhausted after a full day of cleaning and a minor crisis involving a broken water heater, Eleanor greeted George wearing a simple, clean cotton apron over her dress. "Eleanor," George said, with his tone subtly disappointed as he hung up his hat, "didn't you have time to change? Mrs. Henderson mentioned she saw you out front talking to the mailman." "I only just finished dinner, dear, the boiler." "Yes, but you know what I mean. A man likes to come home and see his wife looking pulled together. It makes the day feel worthwhile, you understand. It's a matter of pride." His words, delivered without malice, felt heavier than any reproach. They reinforced the definition. Her primary value was her ability to aesthetically validate his success. She was a trophy on the mantelpiece of his achievement, and she needed to sparkle. The subtlety of surveillance. The final crucial component of the new domestic queen ideal was the system of subtle surveillance that enforced it. In the suburb, privacy was a myth. The open-plan living, the proximity of the houses, and the constant rounds of bridge parties and coffee clutches ensured that every woman was perpetually being judged by her peers. The judgment was delivered not through open criticism, but through pointed compliments and detailed observation. "My, your floors are so dull today. Are you sure you're using the right wax?" "That cake is delicious, dear, but I noticed you didn't trim the crusts quite evenly. Such a pity to waste a good effort." "Your lipstick is a lovely shade, dear, but your neckline has just a little pilling there. Are you getting enough rest?" These comments, often cloaked as helpful advice, acted as a relentless pressure to conform. To be found wanting in domestic or aesthetic duties was to face social ostracization, the silent withdrawal of invitations, and the implication that one was a poor influence.
Eleanor realized that the true crown of the domestic queen was not made of gold, but of an infinitely delicate filigree of expectation, constantly threatening to shatter under the slightest weight of genuine human messiness or fatigue. She had been crowned, yes, but her reign was one of constant, exhausting performance, where her appearance was her scepter and her flawless conduct was the law. The next challenge, as the magazines flooded her mailbox, would be deciphering the increasingly complex and contradictory messages about the products she was required to buy to maintain this throne. The holy text of domesticity. The true architects of the perfect housewife were not the women themselves, but the burgeoning advertising industry, which discovered in the post-war woman a vast, untapped market.
The women's magazines, McCall's, Woman's Day, and Eleanor's personal favorite, Ladies' Home Journal, were not merely reading material. They were the holy text of domesticity, and the advertisements within were its most compelling sermons. For Eleanor, the arrival of the monthly issues was a ritual. She would spread them across her dining room table, a freshly brewed cup of coffee beside her, and pore over the glossy pages. The editorial content offered recipes and advice, but the advertisements delivered the mandate. They transformed the act of self-care and housekeeping into a moral and patriotic duty, creating needs where none had existed before. The core message was terrifyingly simple. A woman's worth was quantifiable by the quality of the products she used to maintain her appearance and her home. If she failed, it was her fault, easily remedied by purchasing the right cleanser, the right hairspray, or the right oven cleaner. The litany of imperfection. The advertisement specialized in inventing and exploiting psychological insecurities, often employing a pseudo-scientific language of fear. They didn't just sell lipstick, they sold protection against social failure. They didn't just sell soap, they sold redemption from domestic shame. Eleanor was particularly susceptible to the campaigns that focused on hygiene and subtle flaws, capitalizing on the suburban fear of social judgment. The tragic truth about Tattletale Gray. Detergent ads portrayed neighbors whispering judgmentally about laundry that wasn't perfectly white. Tattletale Gray was not merely a faded shirt, it was an indictment of the housewife's effort, a visible sign of her failure to live up to the national standard of purity. The threat of undeodor. Campaigns for specific types of soap implied that every woman, no matter how clean, was perpetually harboring a hidden, embarrassing smell that only their product could vanquish. Don't let lipstick run, his eyes will follow. Makeup ads linked flawless application directly to marital happiness and the prevention of the husband's wandering eye. A smudged lip was an invitation to infidelity. These ads created a relentless loop of anxiety for Eleanor. As she folded a sheet that wasn't quite as dazzling as the one in the magazine, she felt a genuine prick of guilt. Was she failing George? Were the neighbors secretly judging her clothesline? The sheer psychological weight of these manufactured flaws was exhausting. The gospel of grooming, a daily confession. The beauty regimen was a daily confession of imperfection. The products were the sacraments. Eleanor's morning routine was a microcosm of this mandate. 1. Cleansing and purity. Her face was scrubbed with harsh soaps designed to achieve an apricot-smooth finish. If she had a breakout, the ad copy rang in her ears. A flawless face is the sign of a clear conscience. Next came the foundation, not just to color, but to create a uniform mask. The heavy creams and powders were designed to erase the reality of motherhood and labor. The goal was to look eternally 22 and perpetually rested. The architectural hair. Her hair, her greatest source of anxiety, required a strategic application of hairspray, a relatively new invention. The aerosol mist was a final sealing agent, ensuring that the carefully constructed waves would withstand the humidity of the kitchen and the rush of the afternoon. Her hair was not meant to move, it was meant to be static, a helmet of perfection. This meticulous grooming was not seen as vanity, it was self-respect. A woman who took pride in her appearance was a woman who took pride in her home, her husband, and her country. Conversely, a woman who let herself go was seen as selfish, lazy, and potentially subversive to the social order. The commercialization of femininity. The advertising campaigns were masterfully crafted to merge femininity with consumerism. The woman was told she was in charge, she was the purchasing agent for the family, but her choices were strictly prescribed. Eleanor saved her weekly allowance meticulously, prioritizing products that addressed her weakest spots. She bought the Tony Home Permanent Kit, enduring the acrid, burning smell of the chemicals to ensure her hair had the necessary lift. She bought Maidenform bras, which promised to sculpt her figure into the ideal hourglass shape, ensuring she looked suitably feminine beneath her starched cotton dress. The ads frequently used an appeal to aspiration, linking the product to a life of glamour and ease. Actresses and models, impossibly chic and relaxed, were posed lounging in environments that had no relation to Eleanor's daily reality of changing diapers and scrubbing toilets. Yet the implication was, buy this lipstick and you buy a small piece of that life. The cruelest irony was that the very tools meant to simplify her life, the detergents, the appliances, the makeup, were adding to her burdens. The time saved by the automatic washer was immediately consumed by the increased expectation for flawless whiteness. The ease of packaged cake mix meant she was now expected to bake a wider variety of desserts. The products promised freedom, but delivered a more rigid cage. The subterranean descent. Beneath the surface of this consumer-driven conformity, however, a tiny seed of dissent began to sprout in Eleanor. It often began in the privacy of the bathroom mirror. After a long day, as she was forced to remove the heavy layer of makeup, the ritual of unmasking, she would look at her reflection with a sense of weary alienation. The woman looking back wasn't Eleanor. She was the product of Revlon, good housekeeping, and George's expectations. One night, Evelyn Albright had paid a surprise visit, and Eleanor, having just removed her rollers and smeared her face with cold cream, had been caught unguarded. Evelyn, aghast, had stopped dead in the hallway. "Eleanor, what on earth are you doing to your face and your hair? You look ill." The shame was instant and scalding. Eleanor stammered an excuse about a headache, but the damage was done. Evelyn had witnessed the process, the messy, unflattering construction of the perfect Eleanor. That night, Eleanor sat on the edge of her tub, staring at a magazine advertisement for a new skin lotion that promised to make her look effortlessly radiant. She felt a sudden surge of something cold and hard, not guilt, but anger. She picked up the glossy page and slowly, deliberately, she tore the advertisement in half, then into quarters, and then into tiny, unrecognizable shreds. The rebellious act was small, silent, and entirely private, but it was the first time she had acknowledged the weariness of the gospel of grooming. The magazines demanded perfection, but perfection was a lie, built on chemical sprays and heavy foundation. And as the remnants of the ad fluttered into the wastebasket, Eleanor realized that the true struggle wasn't against dirt or wrinkles. It was against the insidious, commercialized definition of who she was supposed to be. The mandate had created the ideal, and now Eleanor had to find a way to live inside it without losing herself entirely.
The morning transformation. For Eleanor Atherton, the morning was not a time for gentle awakening. It was the start of an elaborate, highly choreographed performance. The transition from the reality of her natural self to the expectation of the domestic queen was a complex, hour-long process that took place in the steamy, cramped sanctuary of her bathroom. This was where the daily ritual began, a mandatory purification and adornment designed to present an image of flawless, effortless femininity.
The foundation of the ritual was literally foundation. Eleanor started with her face. After scrubbing with a harsh, drying soap, she applied the thick, creamy base, often Max Factor's pancake makeup, with a damp sponge. This was not a subtle enhancement. It was a deliberate mask. The foundation was designed to create a uniform, matte surface, erasing the redness of effort, the dark circles of fatigue, and any freckles that suggested an untamed, outdoorsy life. The ideal face was porcelain smooth, suggesting a life lived indoors, shielded from the sun, stress, and domestic sweat. This layer of makeup was essential for the housewife's dignity. To be seen without it was to be seen as incomplete, or worse, slovenly. It was the visual equivalent of an impeccably ironed linen napkin, a sign that everything was under control. The architecture of the figure. The true engineering of the feminine delicacy occurred beneath the clothes. The 1950s silhouette was an architectural marvel, achieved not by nature, but by rigorous fasteners and supportive garments. The body was literally molded into the desired shape. Eleanor first stepped into her girdle. Made of rigid elastic and boning, this garment cinched her waist, flattened her stomach, and smoothed her hips. It was an instrument of discomfort, squeezing her organs and restricting her movement, but it provided the necessary foundation for the fitted dresses and circle skirts. The girdle represented control over the body, a physical demonstration that the woman was disciplined, resisting the chaotic urges of nature. Above the girdle came the bra, specifically designed to create the exaggerated bullet or conical shape so popular at the time. This was often achieved with circular stitching and stiff cups, pushing the bust up and out. This sharp, defined profile was a hallmark of the era, a clear demarcation of feminine identity. Over this infrastructure, Eleanor then added layers of stiff, starched petticoats. These voluminous slips provided the necessary support to make her full skirt stand out from her hips, creating the iconic wasp waist hourglass figure. The petticoats rustled as she walked, an auditory signal of her presence and her femininity. By the time she was dressed, Eleanor was wearing a structured armor of cotton, elastic, metal, and plastic. Her movements were necessarily delicate. She couldn't slump, run, or bend too sharply without risking discomfort or, heaven forbid, wrinkling the carefully constructed layers. The clothes dictated her demeanor, reinforcing the image of a poised, gentle lady. The ritual of the hair and hand. Next came the final touches, the meticulous grooming of the visible elements, hair and hands. The hair, already set and shellacked from the night before, required only minimal adjustment, thanks to the miracle of hairspray. This chemical mist, pioneered in the early 1950s, was the ultimate fastener for the aesthetic. It preserved the perfect wave and curl against wind, cooking steam, and the energetic demands of child-rearing. Eleanor would lift sections of her hair and spray directly into the underside, ensuring every strand stayed precisely where it was supposed to be. The hands were perhaps the most crucial part of the performance. The hands of a busy homemaker should show wear, but the mandate decreed otherwise. Eleanor spent time smoothing lotion onto her skin, pushing back cuticles, and, most importantly, applying her Revlon nail polish. The shade was always a carefully chosen color, bright red for flair, or a soft coral for everyday elegance. The perfect manicured nail was the final touch of feminine delicacy. suggesting a woman whose daily tasks were handled with such poise that her hands never suffered the indignity of hard work. The hands were symbols. They were the tools used to bake the perfect pie, knit the perfect sweater, and apply the perfect makeup. Yet they had to remain pristine, utterly contradicting the labor they performed. The result of this rigorous ritual was an image of stunning but fragile perfection. Eleanor looked exactly like the advertisements promised, serene, polished, and effortlessly beautiful. But the cost was constant, low-level discomfort. The tight girdle made deep breaths difficult. The stiff petticoat scratched her legs. The heavy foundation felt like a second skin, trapping heat and moisture. She couldn't lean back in her chair for fear of crushing her elaborately set hairdo. This physical discomfort was an unspoken collective secret among the women of Pinecone Hills. It was a shared penance for the crime of being a woman in the demanding new world. This feminine delicacy was, in truth, a carefully engineered physical constraint. It ensured that women moved slowly, sat properly, and remained, both physically and symbolically, confined to the domestic sphere. Eleanor often found herself watching the children play outside, running, jumping, and tumbling with a freedom she no longer possessed. She was their observer, separated from their unbridled movement by the layers of her own appearance. She was the statue of perfection in the garden of their play. The moment of sealing. The final act of the daily ritual was the application of lipstick. Standing at the mirror, Eleanor would trace the precise outline of her mouth with a sharp pencil and then fill it in with a vibrant, matte color. This was the seal, the final layer of lacquer on the polished image. It was a conscious act of emotional regulation. Once the lipstick was applied, the mask was complete, and she was ready to face the world. She was ready for the arrival of George, ready for the critical eye of Evelyn Albright, and ready to assume her role as the domestic queen. She looked in the mirror one last time. The woman staring at her was beautiful, controlled, and deeply protected by her layers of foundation and fasteners. But as she walked out of the bathroom and into the immaculate kitchen, a small, weary voice whispered in her mind, "How long can I hold the pose?" The daily ritual provided the necessary armor, but every application wore away a little piece of the woman beneath. The price of feminine delicacy was the suppression of the real self, a sacrifice performed every morning in front of a fogged-up mirror. The ritual had defined her, but now the rigidity of that definition was beginning to crack under the weight of her own yearning for authenticity. The aesthetics of domesticity. The mandate for the 1950s housewife, Eleanor knew, was not just to look perfect, but to ensure her surroundings reflected that same flawless aesthetic control. Her meticulously sprayed hairdo, her stiffly starched petticoats, and her gleaming lipstick were all components of an invisible uniform that extended beyond her body and into the very fabric of her home. The house itself was the grand, unchanging backdrop against which her own beauty was displayed. If her hair was a sculpted work of art, then the living room rug had to be an equally pristine canvas. If her face was smooth and flawless beneath its foundation, then the countertops had to be spotless and gleaming. The house and the woman were meant to be two perfectly synchronized reflections of the post-war ideal of order, prosperity, and emotional security. This alignment was crucial because the external world, the critical eye of the neighbor, the demanding expectations of the husband, saw the house and the wife as a single, indivisible entity. A chipped teacup was as much a flaw as a chipped nail polish. A stain on the sofa was as damning as a run in a stocking.
The tyranny of white and chrome. In the Atherton house in Pine Knoll Heights, this uniform expressed itself in a tyranny of white appliances and chrome accents. The new domestic technologies were not just functional, they were decorative symbols of modernity and hygiene. Eleanor spent hours ensuring her Frigidaire and her electric stove gleamed with an almost painful brilliance. The kitchen, in particular, was the heart of the home and the most visible metric of her success. It was meant to look perpetually unused, even minutes after she had finished a complex cooking project. The countertops, scrubbed with a mixture of bleach and ammonia until they reflected the overhead lighting. Any residue of flour or spilled coffee was a sign of laxity. The sink, never under any circumstances could a dish be left in the sink. The sight of a soaking bowl was visual proof of a domestic crisis. The linens, all tea towels and dish rags had to be perfectly white, ironed and neatly stacked, ready for display. Eleanor often felt like a cleaner in a museum, constantly polishing artifacts that could not be touched. She wore her house dresses while performing these tasks, ensuring she was ready for an unexpected visitor, and she moved with the careful, constrained movements necessitated by her girdle. She was the pristine reflection in the pristine chrome. Color coordination and emotional control. The decorating standards of the 1950s also mirrored the emotional restraint demanded of the housewife. The fashionable colors, pastels, soft blues, mint greens, and atomic pinks, were soothing, carefully selected to create an atmosphere of calm and serenity. Wild colors or eccentric design choices were considered jarring and indicative of a restless or unstable mind. Eleanor's own living room was decorated in shades of seafoam green and soft yellow. Every cushion was fluffed, every magazine stack was squared, and the ceramic lamp base was meticulously dusted. This visual calm was meant to soothe George after his hard day's work. It was an unspoken, material promise. I have everything handled. Nothing here is out of order. You are safe. The irony, of course, was that maintaining this pervasive atmosphere of calm required intense, almost frantic physical labor. Eleanor would often race through the house before George arrived, smoothing the last crease from a slipcover or banishing a stray dust bunny, her heart pounding with the stress of maintaining the illusion. The external calmness of the home was inversely proportional to the internal frenzy of the woman who ran it. The staging of the children. Even the children, little George Jr. and Susie, were part of the invisible uniform. They were to be as neatly kept as the house itself, a testament to Eleanor's maternal diligence. Their clothes were always starched and pressed. Their hair was always neatly combed. The boys with their slicked side parts, Susie with her perfect braids or ribbons. A dirty child was a reflection of a dirty house and ultimately a dirty woman. Eleanor often overheard the neighbor, Evelyn Albright, discussing her own children with a tight, competitive pride. My children know the rules, Eleanor. They know that to stain a shirt is to spoil the line. They learn early that perfection is necessary. This pressure meant Eleanor was constantly policing their natural exuberance. Don't run in the house, you'll track in dirt. Don't lean against the wall, you'll leave a mark. The children, like Eleanor herself, were expected to move through their lives with a conscious, deliberate avoidance of disorder. Their playtime was often relegated to the backyard, far from the immaculate, adult-centered living spaces. The private mess, a necessary sin.
The pressure to maintain this spotless uniform eventually led to the creation of private spaces of controlled chaos. Every perfect housewife had one room, one corner, or one drawer where the mess could be hidden, where the aesthetic control could momentarily lapse. For Eleanor, it was the small utility closet near the laundry area. Shoved inside were items that didn't match the harmonious color scheme. George's ancient paint-splattered work trousers, a ragged, comfortable sweater she sometimes threw on late at night, the torn-up magazine advertisement she had destroyed in a brief fit of frustration. It was in this closet that the real labor was concealed. The yellowed cleaning cloths, the industrial-strength scrubbing brushes that were too harsh to be left out, the chipped vase that she hadn't had time to replace. She would hastily shove things into this closet when the doorbell rang, hiding the tools of her trade and the evidence of her effort. The closet was the psychological safety valve for the entire house. It allowed the rest of the home to remain an illusion because the reality of the mess was safely locked away. This tiny, hidden space represented the psychological split the invisible uniform created. The woman who emerged from that closet was polished and poised, the ideal. But the woman who managed the chaos inside it was tired, human, and perpetually overwhelmed. The hairdo as a house code. The connection between the housewife's appearance and the home's maintenance was perhaps best symbolized by her rigid hairdo. The stiff, immovable curl was the human equivalent of the house's immaculate condition. It signified immovability. The woman is steady, reliable, and perfectly disciplined, just like the unchanging order of the home. Lack of emotion. Just as a controlled color palette suppresses visual excitement, the controlled hair suppresses any hint of passionate disorder. Proof of leisure. The complex hairstyle, which took hours of labor, was meant to suggest she had endless time for self-maintenance, implying that the home ran itself. One afternoon, a torrential rainstorm hit Pine Knoll Heights just as Eleanor was retrieving Susie from the neighbor's house. She was caught off guard, and by the time she reached her own porch, the meticulously sculpted waves of her hair had begun to wilt, becoming frizzy and unkempt. George had just arrived home and witnessed the sight. He didn't say anything about the rain or about Susie. He simply looked at Eleanor's drooping hair. "Eleanor," his voice flat with disappointment, "you look completely undone." The word struck her like a physical blow. Undone. It meant more than just her hair. It meant the fragile image of their life. The neatness, the security, the calm was momentarily compromised. Her hair was falling apart, and therefore her home, her composure, and her worth were also falling apart. The invisible uniform was less a choice and more a binding law, demanding that she match the flawless, unchanging nature of the suburban dream, a task she knew deep down was impossible. The contract of appearance. The unspoken truth of the perfect housewife ideal was that her beauty was not a form of personal expression, but a clause in her marital contract. Her meticulous grooming, the stiff structure of her garments, and the serene mask of her makeup were all dedicated to one primary audience, her husband George. Her appearance was less about self-adornment and more about fulfilling a marital duty. In the patriarchal structure of the 1950s, a wife's physical perfection served two critical functions for her husband. It affirmed his success and guaranteed his possession. First, Eleanor's beauty was a direct, visual testament to George's capability as a provider. A man with a flawlessly groomed, well-dressed wife signaled to the world that he was financially successful enough to afford a woman who did not need to perform manual labor outside the home. Her hands were soft because his wallet was large. Her clothes were pristine because his career was thriving. She was a living trophy, polished daily to reflect his achievement. Second, her attention to her appearance was a daily reaffirmation of her dedication and respect for him. The magazines and societal norms suggested that a woman who let herself go was essentially disrespecting her husband's hard work and inviting his discontent. To maintain her looks was to maintain the marriage.
The expectation of the evening. For Eleanor, the pressure of the husband's gaze peaked every evening at 5:30 p.m., the moment George walked through the door. She had learned to anticipate the subtle shift in his expression that served as his daily verdict. If Eleanor was perfectly composed, hair intact, dress fresh, lipstick unsmudged, George would reward her with a brief proprietary kiss and a tone of satisfied approval. "You look nice, Elle. Everything smells wonderful." This approval was the highest currency Eleanor could earn. It validated her existence for the entire day. But if, on an evening when the children had been particularly demanding or the washing machine had sprung a leak, Eleanor greeted him looking even slightly disheveled, a wrinkle on her skirt, a wisp of hair escaping her chignon, George's disappointment was immediate, though often unvoiced. He wouldn't raise his voice. His censure was far more effective when delivered through cold, quiet observation. "Rough day, dear?" he might ask, his eyes lingering on the faint smudges beneath her eyes, a flaw the foundation hadn't quite concealed. This simple question implied a deep failure. A perfect housewife was never supposed to have a rough day that showed on her face. Her role was to be the calm, unchanging center of the home, regardless of the chaos she managed. Her fatigue was a visible failure to perform her marital duty. The private audit of the body. The duty of beauty also extended into the most intimate aspects of their lives. Eleanor felt that even in the privacy of their bedroom, she was still performing for George's approval. She rarely removed her girdle entirely until she was certain George was asleep, terrified of allowing him to see her body in its natural, uncontrolled state. The nightly ritual was a secondary form of preparation. Eleanor would apply heavy night creams, wrap her hair in rollers, and don a perfectly pressed satin nightgown, even if she longed for the comfort of soft cotton. The nightgown was not for her comfort, it was for George's aesthetic pleasure. Her body was constantly under audit, and she felt compelled to maintain the feminine delicacy even under the sheets. Psychologists and marriage counselors of the era reinforced this idea, advising wives that sexual attraction was a continuous, necessary element of marriage, and that neglecting one's appearance was tantamount to emotional infidelity. Eleanor absorbed this message. Her beauty was the prophylactic against her husband's boredom and potentially his wandering eye. She remembered a terrifying article in a popular women's magazine that warned, "The most common reason a man strays is that his wife has forgotten how to be his sweetheart. Don't let your apron replace your allure." This became Eleanor's private mantra of anxiety. Every skipped manicure or rushed hair setting felt like a direct risk to her marriage. The aesthetics of reciprocity. The crucial difference in the marital expectation was the near total lack of reciprocity. While Eleanor's day was consumed by the aesthetic maintenance of her home and her body for George, his own appearance required minimal effort beyond the basic standards of professional attire. George's grooming was about professionalism, Eleanor's was about personhood. He shaved, wore a pressed suit, and kept his shoes shined, all signs of his seriousness as a provider. But he wasn't expected to maintain an idealized figure, cover the stress lines on his face with makeup, or worry about the exact shade of his tie matching the sofa. His power and value were inherent in his role. Eleanor's had to be painstakingly constructed and maintained. This stark contrast highlighted the unequal burden of the perfect housewife ideal. Eleanor often watched George as he effortlessly shed his suit jacket after a long day, relaxing into his armchair, completely unaware of the physical constraints and performative strain she was still enduring. The price of possession. The weight of the husband's gaze became a heavy psychological tax on Eleanor. It slowly eroded her sense of self-worth, making her value conditional on her appearance.
She began to resent the constant need for his approval. She felt less like a partner and more like a high-maintenance asset that required constant upkeep. Yet the fear of losing the security that George and his income provided was a powerful deterrent to rebellion. One afternoon, Eleanor found herself staring at her wedding photo, a picture of a young woman with a genuine, slightly mischievous smile before the heavy mantle of the perfect housewife had settled upon her. George walked in and saw her gazing at the picture. He smiled fondly. "Look at us, Elle. We were so young. But you know," he added, his gaze moving from the photo to Eleanor's current composed face, "I like you even better now. You're so much more polished." His compliment, intended to be loving, felt like an icy judgment. The woman he had married, the natural, sometimes messy, sometimes laughing girl, was less appealing to him than the meticulously crafted object she had become. The word polished echoed in her ears, reducing her existence to the state of a well-maintained piece of furniture. She realized then that her beauty was a form of possession. By flawlessly maintaining her appearance, she was affirming George's ownership and his control over her image. The husband's gaze was a constant, gentle pressure that ensured she never deviated from the prescribed aesthetic, a duty performed not out of love, but out of necessity and fear. The perfection she displayed was less a mirror of her soul and more a shield against her husband's potential dissatisfaction, ensuring the continuation of the comfortable yet confining contract of their marriage. The hour of performance. The time between 4 p.m. and 6 p.m. was not merely the dinner preparation hour, it was the most critical hour of performance in Eleanor Atherton's day. It was a period when the demands of the perfect housewife ideal clashed violently with the gritty reality of physical labor. She had to transform raw ingredients into a 3-course meal while simultaneously ensuring her own elaborate appearance remained impeccable. This was the true kitchen crisis, the expectation to cook dinner in heels and pearls. The attire was mandatory. She could not risk George arriving home and finding her in a state of dishabille. The starched cotton dress, the cinching girdle, the pearl stud earrings, and the full face of foundation were all required to signal her domestic composure. And yes, oftentimes, the low, sensible heels were kept on, adding an inch of elegant height while subtracting comfort and stability. The kitchen, meant to be a modern marvel, felt instead like a stoffing and poorly ventilated stage. The heat from the oven and the steam from the boiling vegetables created a climate of immediate sabotage for her carefully crafted image. The battle against steam and splatter. The first casualty of the kitchen crisis was always the hairdo. The meticulous lacquered waves, designed to withstand a gentle suburban breeze, buckled under the onslaught of cooking heat. Eleanor learned to open the kitchen window regardless of the outside temperature, hoping to draw the heat away. But the steam from the percolator and the boiling pot of water was relentless. She had developed a nervous, almost balleric style of cooking, a series of constrained movements designed to protect her clothes and her hair. She leaned away from the sizzling bacon, holding her breath to avoid inhaling the grease that could settle on her polished face. She reached awkwardly over pots, her arms outstretched to avoid the steam that would turn her stiff curls into frizz. The crisp white apron, while a necessity, was a psychological hazard. It had to be spotless. A single visible splash of tomato sauce or a smear of flour was not only a stain, it was an indictment of her clumsiness and her lack of control. She changed aprons sometimes 3 times during the dinner process, discarding the soiled ones quickly into the utility closet, desperate to hide the evidence of her effort.
The problem with pearls and pumps. The accessories meant to elevate her femininity became obstacles to her efficiency. The pearls, a symbol of elegance and leisure, often got in the way. They had to be constantly tucked beneath her apron to prevent them from dipping into a bowl of batter or catching on a pot handle. The simple act of bending over the oven meant risking an uncomfortable collision between the jewelry and the stove. The heels, even the sensible ones, turned the act of standing for 2 hours into an exercise in quiet endurance. The kitchen floor, hard tile over concrete, offered no forgiveness. Her feet ached, but to remove the shoes would be to break the uniform before George arrived. The pain was part of the price of the illusion. The perfect housewife floats. She does not stump with aching feet. One evening, while rushing to pull a roast from the oven, the heel of her pump slipped on a small bead of spilled oil. She caught herself on the counter with a gasp, narrowly avoiding a fall and a serious burn. The near disaster was terrifying, not only because of the physical danger, but because of the shame of potentially being found injured and disheveled by George. The incident underscored the danger of the pose. The commitment to aesthetic over practicality put her at risk. The mask of tranquility. Despite the intense heat, the physical strain, and the rush against the clock, Eleanor was strictly required to maintain the mask of tranquility. When George arrived, he needed to feel the soothing calm of his home. She had to ensure that the emotional chaos of the kitchen crisis, the frustration of a burnt sauce, the panic of a deflating soufflé, the exhaustion of standing for hours, was completely contained. She could curse softly at the stove, but the moment she heard the crunch of George's Buick on the driveway, the mask had to snap back into place. She would instinctively run a gloved hand over her hair to check the set, touch up her lipstick, and most importantly, smooth the expression on her face into one of serene maternal patience. The transformation from frantic cook to poised wife had to be instantaneous and flawless. One evening, George brought home a colleague, Mr. Harrison, unannounced. Eleanor was in the middle of wrestling a stubborn roast pan and was momentarily flustered. "Eleanor, dear, I brought Mr. Harrison home. I hope you don't mind," George announced, smiling proudly. Eleanor turned, forcing the smile. Mr. Harrison looked past her to the kitchen counter, which held a momentary collection of flour and discarded vegetable peelings. "A working kitchen," Mr. Harrison chuckled good-naturedly. "Glad to see someone actually uses these modern contraptions." Eleanor felt the shame instantly. The word working was a criticism in disguise. It meant the kitchen looked used, which in Pine Knoll Heights was equivalent to looking messy. George quickly changed the subject, but later, after the guests had gone, he spoke to Eleanor in a low voice. "Elle, I appreciate all your hard work, truly, but when I bring a superior home, I need the house to look better than working. You had flour on your cheek. It just makes me look unprofessional, dear." The reprimand confirmed her fears. The effort didn't count. Only the final, effortless-looking product mattered. The kitchen crisis was a secret she was meant to manage and suppress entirely. The double labor. The ultimate crisis was the double labor required. Eleanor was not simply cooking dinner. She was simultaneously managing the production of the meal and the maintenance of the ideal aesthetic. Every domestic task was overlaid with an aesthetic burden. Washing dishes had to be done immediately while wearing clean gloves to protect the manicure. Wiping counters had to be done with quick, precise motions to avoid smearing the perfect hairdo on the cabinets. Carrying trays had to be done with an upright, graceful posture, restricting natural movement. The dinner hour was a crucible where the feminine delicacy of the ritual was tested by the brute force of domestic work. The contradiction was exhausting. She had to be a laborer, but look like a lady of leisure. As Eleanor finally poured George his after-dinner coffee, watching him relax on the sofa, she felt a profound sense of alienation. She had successfully navigated the kitchen crisis. The dinner was cooked, the kitchen was spotless, and her appearance remained intact. She had fulfilled her duty. But the exhaustion in her feet, the faint steam-induced wilting of her hair, and the tension in her jaw were the invisible scars of the battle. She had won the hour, but the war for her authentic self was being lost, one pearl and one heel at a time. The unbudgeted line item. The cost of maintaining the perfect housewife ideal was far more than a matter of time and exhaustion. It represented a substantial yet largely unacknowledged financial burden on the nuclear family. In the Atherton household, George budgeted meticulously for the mortgage, the groceries, and the car payments. But the never-ending stream of money required to uphold Eleanor's image was the great, unbudgeted, hidden expense of beauty maintenance. Eleanor received a weekly allowance from George, a fixed amount intended to cover small household necessities and her personal needs. However, the sheer volume of mandated products necessary for her aesthetic and domestic duties meant that her personal needs were always secondary, and the allowance was perpetually stretched thin. The expectation was that the housewife should be effortlessly beautiful, but that effort was wholly dependent on an army of commercially available goods, each with a price tag. The endless inventory of necessity. Eleanor maintained a complex, constantly rotating inventory of beauty and grooming supplies. These weren't luxuries, they were necessities for maintaining her social standing and, by extension, George's. 1. The foundation of the home. This included the vast array of specialized cleaning products. The kitchen floor required one specific wax, the furniture another polish. The silver needed a separate paste, and the laundry demanded 3 different detergents to combat tattletale gray and undie odor. Each product was marketed as essential for the modern, efficient home, forcing Eleanor to juggle brands and costs. 2. The tools of the face. Her monthly expenditure on cosmetics was a silent drain. Foundation, powder, lipstick, eyeliner, mascara, cold cream, astringent, and specialized night creams. Each was depleted quickly and had to be replaced before the stocks ran dry. She couldn't risk running out of her specific shade of pan-cake makeup and being forced to appear unmasked or improperly colored. The hair's high price. Hair maintenance was the single most costly item. Regular trims, which she often avoided by trimming her own hair in secret. Bobby pins, rollers, setting lotion, and the highly priced aerosol hairspray, the quintessential tool for immobility, all added up. The Tony Home Permanent Kit, while cheaper than a salon visit, was still a significant expense, not to mention the risk of failure that required a costly correction. To afford these essentials, Eleanor engaged in constant, exhausting financial triage. She would often skimp on her own lunches, buying inexpensive bread,
A can of soup instead of fresh produce, channeling the saved pennies into a new tube of lipstick or a jar of Pond's cold cream. The hidden costs of the uniform. The clothing itself was another major hidden expense. While George's suits were an acknowledged business cost, Eleanor's invisible uniform was categorized merely as personal spending. Yet her wardrobe was just as vital to the family's image. She needed an array of pristine ironed house dresses, suitable for different times of the day and different visitors. Furthermore, the necessary fasteners, the girdles, the structured bras, and the petticoats wore out quickly under the stress of daily use and harsh cleaning. A girdle that lost its elasticity was not just uncomfortable, it was a failure in maintaining the required silhouette and had to be immediately replaced, regardless of the cost. Eleanor had learned to become a shrewd, secretive bargain hunter. She haunted the fabric stores, buying remnants to sew new curtains or mend her petticoats, often performing the needlework late at night under a small lamp so George wouldn't see her laboring over the expenses. The psychological cost of frugality. The relentless need to be beautiful on a tight budget created a severe psychological strain. Eleanor felt constant guilt over every necessary purchase. If she bought a new bottle of expensive facial cleanser, she felt she was taking money away from the children's savings. If she skimped on the quality of a dish soap, she feared she was risking the family's health or reputation. This internal conflict was amplified by the advertisements, which simultaneously demanded perfection and celebrated the housewife as a shrewd, financially prudent manager. The magazines presented the perfect woman as someone who could somehow afford all the necessities while still being frugal, a truly impossible standard. The only way to reconcile this was to keep the true cost of her aesthetic duties a secret from George. If he saw the final tallies, he might question the expense, and questioning the expense would be questioning the necessity of the aesthetic ideal itself, a conversation Eleanor was too afraid to start. The final, unspoken tax. The deepest cost was the emotional and intellectual forfeiture. The money Eleanor saved by sewing her own dresses could have been spent on a college course or books on a subject she was genuinely interested in. The time spent meticulously applying foundation or sleeping on prickly rollers could have been used to pursue an intellectual hobby or simply get sufficient, unburdened rest. The cost of perfection was not just a line item on her fictional budget. It was the cost of her autonomy and her potential. She was financially bound to the aesthetic ideal, spending her energy, her money, and her mental space on maintaining an image that was ultimately created to serve the comfort and status of others. One afternoon, Eleanor found an old leather wallet belonging to George in a drawer. Inside, she saw a crisp $20 bill, a sum that could cover her entire month's worth of lipstick and foundation. She briefly considered taking it, telling herself it was justified by all the work she did. But the deep-seated fear of George's disapproval and the shattering of the trust contract stopped her. She returned the wallet untouched. Instead, she took her own meager allowance and walked to the drugstore, buying a cheaper brand of hand lotion than usual. As she held the bottle, she realized that the price of perfection was paid in endless small sacrifices, quietly made and entirely invisible. The hidden expenses of beauty maintenance were the final, crucial chains of the perfect housewife trap. They ensured that she remained financially tethered to the very aesthetic that was slowly exhausting her soul. The flawless image was a commodity, and Eleanor was forced to be both the manufacturer and the perpetually unpaid consumer of her own beautiful, suffocating uniform. The wasp waist imperative. If the hair and the house were symbols of the perfect housewife's control, the ideal silhouette was the ultimate proof of her moral fortitude. The prevailing fashion of the 1950s demanded a shape defined by a dramatically small waist, a gently rounded bust, and full yet controlled hips. The quintessential wasp waist hourglass. This was not a natural figure for most women, making the effort to achieve it an exhausting, lifelong commitment to diet and denial. For Eleanor Arthurton, this pressure was constant and pervasive. Her body, like her home, was required to be perfectly managed. The media declared that a slender figure signaled self-discipline, energy, and youthfulness, while a woman who was overweight was often pathologized as morally weak, lazy, or emotionally unstable. The expectation created a profound contradiction in Eleanor's life. She was the domestic queen, expected to produce rich, nourishing dinners, roasts, cream sauces, elaborate desserts, to affirm her status as a provider. Yet she was simultaneously expected to deny herself the pleasure of eating them. The tools of constraint. The first line of defense against the natural human body was, as always, the physical fasteners. The rigid girdle and structured bra were necessary tools for sculpting the body into the correct 1950s shape. The girdle, a tight cage of elastic and boning, cinched Eleanor's waist and flattened her stomach, often leaving painful red marks on her skin by the end of the day. It restricted her breathing and digestion, making the simple act of sitting down a conscious, uncomfortable maneuver. The girdle served as a constant physical reminder of her duty to be small and contained. However, the girdles could only contain, they couldn't reduce. The real battle was fought on the dinner plate. The denial at the dinner table. The great irony of the suburban dream was that the kitchen,
the central symbol of feminine power and plenty, became a daily sight of agonizing self-denial for the woman who ran it. Eleanor prepared the elaborate, high-calorie dinners required to sustain George, the breadwinner, and the growing children, the future, but she ate her own meals under a strict calorie budget. George's plate, 3 slices of roast beef, buttered potatoes, a generous portion of creamed spinach, and a thick slice of apple pie. Eleanor's plate, a small, lean piece of meat, a single spoonful of plain green beans, and a black coffee. She had to maintain a facade of cheerful participation, constantly offering seconds and encouraging her family to enjoy the food she craved. She would often stand while supervising the meal, citing the need to attend to the children or clear dishes, ensuring she didn't sit down long enough to be forced to eat a full serving. This was the quiet, invisible strain of her life, the emotional labor of preparing food she could not enjoy, and the continuous internal struggle against hunger and desire. The commercialization of dieting. The advertising industry, having established the ideal, quickly capitalized on women's desperation to achieve it. The 1950s saw the explosion of commercial diet aids, none of which were truly effective, but all of which promised easy transformation. Eleanor was tempted by the endless magazine ads for quick fixes and effortless weight loss. AIDS reducing candy, a chocolate-flavored caramel meant to be eaten before meals to curb appetite. The irony of chocolate being a diet aid was not lost on Eleanor. Appetite suppressants, pills containing everything from vitamins to mild amphetamines, all promising to melt away those extra pounds. Low-calorie foods, the emergence of specific products designed for dieting, often bland and highly processed, yet sold as the enlightened choice of the modern woman. Eleanor secretly bought a box of reducing wafers, hiding them in the back of her pantry, away from George and the children. Eating them felt like a necessary sin, a private attempt to cheat the system that demanded an impossible figure. The shame of being caught using a diet aid was almost as shameful as the shame of being overweight. Both signified a lack of innate control.
The tyranny of the scale. The bathroom scale became Eleanor's constant adversary, a judge delivering a daily sentence. She weighed herself first thing in the morning, holding her breath, praying the needle hadn't crept upward. A 2-pound gain could ruin her entire day, plunging her into a cycle of self-loathing and stricter denial. A half-pound loss, however, provided a brief, addictive rush of validation, convincing her that the constant hunger and discomfort were worthwhile. This obsession was shared among the women of Pine Knoll Heights. Conversations at the Bridge Club often centered on the latest diet fads, whispered recipes for low-calorie aspects, and thinly veiled bragging about dress sizes. It was a shared penance, but also a fierce, underlying competition. Eleanor remembered Evelyn Albright announcing her new regime. No starches and only 500 calories before 5 o'clock. It's a matter of willpower, Eleanor. We must show our husbands that we are masters of our appetites, just as they are masters of their careers. The constant connection between physical size and moral strength solidified the tyranny of the silhouette. The emotional hunger. The deeper consequence of this perpetual denial was an intense, gnawing, emotional hunger. By rigidly controlling her food and her body, Eleanor was suppressing her own desires, ambitions, and frustrations. The frustration of being confined to the home, the intellectual yearning, and the exhaustion of the performance, all of it manifested as an intense desire for the forbidden richness on her family's plates. Food was comfort, pleasure, and freedom, and all were denied to the perfect housewife. The denial led to secretive, small acts of transgression. Late at night, after George was asleep and the house was silent, Eleanor would sometimes creep down to the kitchen. She wouldn't fix a meal. She would simply steal a single, perfect spoonful of frosting from the cake she had baked for a party, or a small square of cheese. This solitary, forbidden pleasure was a tiny rebellion against the rigid control she maintained all day. The shame was immediate, but the fleeting moment of indulgence provided a necessary emotional release. The ideal silhouette, therefore, was not just a physical shape, it was a psychological boundary. It was the physical manifestation of her suppressed self. The smaller her waist, the smaller the space allowed for her own needs and desires. The perfect housewife was starved, both literally and figuratively, a condition necessary to maintain the illusion of the bountiful, comfortable American dream. The battle of the bulge was not fought with food, it was fought against the self, a silent, exhausting war of diet and denial that threatened to consume Eleanor entirely. The gilded cage of composure. The most damaging aspect of the perfect housewife ideal was its demand for emotional flawlessness. Eleanor's most essential accessory was not her pearl necklace or her rigid girdle, but her fixed, serene smile. This smile, practiced in the mirror every morning, was the final, non-negotiable layer of her uniform. It was the public declaration that everything, the marriage, the home, the children, and her own mind, was perfectly in order. However, beneath this unwavering composure lay a crushing mental toll. The perpetual necessity of acting the part of the happy, fulfilled, and unburdened woman created a state of deep psychological alienation. Eleanor was constantly performing a role, and the suppression of her authentic feelings, her boredom, her intellectual curiosity, her exhaustion, and her anger began to consume her from the inside out. The suburban landscape designed for peace became a prison built of expectation. The walls of her pristine home, instead of offering comfort, felt like the boundaries of a gilded cage. The burden of emotional management. Eleanor's primary emotional duty was emotional management. She was the family's psychological anchor, required to absorb all stress without ever exhibiting her own. For George, she had to be a soothing balm, never introducing her domestic frustrations to his professional stress. His worries were legitimate. Hers were mere woman troubles, easily solved by a new recipe or a fresh coat of paint. For the children, she had to be infinitely patient and sunny, teaching them stability and happiness. Any display of temper or sadness was seen as a failure of motherhood. This meant Eleanor had no legitimate outlet for her own anxiety. When she felt overwhelmed, she couldn't share it with George. It would undermine his sense of security and her image of competence. She couldn't share it with the neighbors. It would invite judgment and pity. The pressure built up in the silent chambers of her mind. She started experiencing physical symptoms of this emotional suppression. Tension headaches that arrived promptly at 5 p.m., just before George's arrival. Insomnia despite her physical exhaustion, and a persistent low-level nausea that no medicine could cure. The loss of self-definition. The relentless performance of the perfect housewife role led to a profound loss of self-definition. Eleanor realized she no longer knew who she was without the layers of makeup, the structured clothing, and the required smile. The ideal had become so consuming that her true self had been starved out. She had been taught that her identity was entirely relational. She was George's wife, Susie and George Jr.'s mother, and the Atherton family homemaker. She was not encouraged to think of herself as Eleanor, the woman with interests, ambitions, and independent thoughts. This vacuum of self-identity created a deep, internal loneliness. She was surrounded by family and neighbors, yet she felt utterly isolated, unable to connect with anyone on a level deeper than the shared superficiality of domestic life. One afternoon, sitting alone in her perfectly dusted living room, Eleanor tried to recall the ambitions she had harbored before the war and marriage. She remembered the faint, thrilling idea of becoming a librarian. The memory was so distant, so foreign to her current reality, that it felt like remembering someone else's life. The realization that her life had been entirely overwritten by a cultural script brought a wave of quiet, desperate panic. The secret world of neurosis. The social norms of the 1950s had no vocabulary for mental anguish outside of clinical, often misogynistic terms. A woman who was genuinely unhappy or felt unfulfilled was pathologized as neurotic or hysterical. The popular cure for this was not therapy or self-discovery, but often tranquilizers like Miltown or Valium, which were heavily marketed to housewives, or even crueler still, more domestic work. The prescription was simple. If you're unhappy, you're not busy enough. If you're bored, your house isn't clean enough. Eleanor never sought help, terrified by the social stigma and the possibility of being labeled a failing wife. Instead, she internalized the problem, believing her unhappiness was a personal failing, a weakness in her character that required her to try harder at perfection. Her private world became a series of ritualistic anxieties, checking and rechecking the oven to make sure it was off, obsessively re-wiping a counter that was already clean, and rehearsing conversations in her head before they happened. These were her coping mechanisms, small, controllable acts of anxiety that displaced the massive, uncontrollable anxiety of her life. The dissociation of the performer. The most telling sign of her psychological strain was a sense of dissociation. Eleanor often felt disconnected from her own actions. She would observe herself moving through the daily rituals, mixing batter, ironing a shirt, smiling at George as if she were watching a film of her own life. The woman in the film was beautiful, efficient, and happy, but she didn't feel like her. This dissociation was a protective barrier. By stepping out of her own body and mind, she could perform the role without feeling the deep pain it inflicted. It allowed her to maintain the fixed smile even when her internal landscape was stormy.
During one of the neighborhood bridge games, while chatting lightly about the price of new drapes, Eleanor looked across the table at Mrs. Evelyn Albright. Evelyn's smile was just as fixed, her hair just as immovable. In that moment, Eleanor didn't see a rival. She saw a fellow performer in the same absurd, exhausting play. She realized the mental toll was not unique to her. It was the collective cost of the perfect housewife ideal. The silence between the women was not companionship. It was the mutual, secret understanding of the lie they were all living. The private hour of unmasking. Eleanor's only release came late at night. When George was finally asleep and the house was absolutely silent, she would go into the bathroom, turn on the cold faucet, and begin the ritual of unmasking. She would scrub away the foundation, remove the tight pins from her hair, and peel off the restrictive girdle. As the physical fasteners came off, the emotional fasteners loosened slightly. Sometimes she would stand at the window, looking out at the dark, silent suburb, and simply cry, silent, uncontrollable tears of exhaustion and grief for the life and the self she had lost. But even this act of release was constrained. She had to stifle her sobs, wipe the tears quickly, and ensure her eyes were not puffy by morning. Even her grief had to be managed and erased before the next day's performance. The mental toll of constant performance had created two Eleanors, the flawless, smiling idol of the day and the weeping, desperate prisoner of the night. The increasing distance between these two selves was the true crisis of the American dream, a dream that bought security at the expense of sanity, demanding that women sacrifice their minds to maintain the illusion of their husbands' perfect lives. The smile was not a sign of happiness. It was a white flag of surrender, flying over a deeply troubled mind. The monotony of perfection. The central tragedy of the perfect housewife was that the goal she was forced to pursue, perfection, was the enemy of purpose.
Once Eleanor Atherton had achieved the flawlessly clean house, the perpetually set hair, and the perfectly managed children, her life settled into a soul-crushing monotony of perfection. The routine, once a comforting structure against the chaos of the outside world, became a suffocating prison. The day-to-day work, while physically demanding, was intellectually sterile. The tasks, washing, ironing, dusting, shopping, cooking, were cyclical, offering no progression, no opportunity for mastery beyond flawless repetition. Every day was a mirror image of the last. Eleanor realized that the American dream she had fought so hard to secure was fundamentally empty for her. She had a new home, new appliances, and new clothes, but the core of her life was filled with a gaping void. This was the phenomenon quietly plaguing the suburbs, the domestic doldrums. The quiet ache of boredom. The specific nature of 1950s boredom for the housewife was a quiet ache, a psychological weight that the culture refused to acknowledge. Boredom was not a luxury, it was a symptom of a denied intellectual and professional life. Eleanor had been taught that her fulfillment lay entirely within the home, yet the reality was that a college-educated, intelligent woman was forced to dedicate her considerable mental energies to tasks a teenager could perform. The dissonance was painful. She tried to fight the boredom with prescribed activities. Over-cleaning. She would compulsively scrub corners of the house that were already clean, sometimes stripping and re-waxing floors unnecessarily, mistaking physical exertion for purpose. Over-mothering. She would hover over the children, insisting on helping with simple tasks, not out of necessity, but to fill the emptiness of her afternoon. This often made the children restless and resentful. Crafting. She bought magazines detailing complex knitting patterns and elaborate paper crafts, hoping the detailed, intricate work would engage her mind. But the finished products merely added to the static perfection of her home, failing to provide lasting satisfaction. These efforts only highlighted the fundamental problem. The activities were substitutes for a genuine external purpose. The search for identity. The overwhelming boredom forced Eleanor into a desperate search for identity outside of her defined roles. The question, "Who am I if I am not cleaning or cooking?" became a constant, silent interrogation. Her search was furtive, pursued in the small pockets of time she could steal away. The library. Once a week, on the pretense of fetching books for the children, Eleanor would sneak into the adult fiction section. She didn't seek out women's novels. She gravitated toward books on philosophy, history, and even complex scientific texts, material that challenged her and reminded her of her untapped intellectual capacity. She would read them rapidly, hiding the books under her mattress before George could see them. A man expected his wife to read novels, but intellectual books were seen as dangerous, a sign of dissatisfaction or unfeminine ambition. Secret writing. Eleanor began keeping a small leather-bound notebook hidden in the back of the utility closet, the same place she hid her mess and her rebellion. In it, she did not keep a diary. She kept observations, small essays, and character sketches of her neighbors. It was a place where she could use her mind critically, dissecting the suburban ritual and the perfect people who performed it. It was her secret intellectual life, the only place where the real Eleanor was allowed to exist. The phantom career. She would sometimes daydream of her brief wartime clerical job, missing the structure of the office, the measurable success of a completed ledger, and the camaraderie with her coworkers. She missed the feeling of earning money, not for herself, but for the validation that came from her work having objective, external value. George's blindness and the marital gulf. George, entirely fulfilled by his professional success and the perfect operation of his home, was completely blind to Eleanor's internal crisis. The concept of his wife being bored was utterly foreign to him. It meant his provision was inadequate, which was impossible. When Eleanor once delicately suggested she might take a part-time job, perhaps helping out at the church library, George's reaction was immediate and dismissive. "Why on earth would you need to do that, Elle? We don't need the money, and your place is here. You already have a full-time job running this house. What will people think? It looks like I can't provide for you." His response neatly shut down her ambition, reinforcing the idea that her identity had to be sacrificed for his status. To George, her boredom was a selfish complaint. To Eleanor, it was an existential scream. This created a profound marital gulf. She was living an internal life he could not comprehend, and he was enforcing a life she could no longer tolerate. The escape of consumption. Lacking a fulfilling internal life, Eleanor, like many women of the era, turned to the only escape permitted by the culture: consumption. The magazines constantly offered a temporary balm for her malaise. Retail therapy. A new dress, a new pair of shoes, or a new decorative knick-knack for the mantelpiece offered a momentary rush of excitement and purpose. Buying something was an act of creation. It introduced something new into the unchanging routine. However, the satisfaction was always fleeting. The new dress quickly became part of the uniform, the knick-knack became another item to dust, and the feeling of emptiness returned, often sharper than before. The search for identity through material goods was a self-defeating cycle, merely reinforcing her role as the passive consumer and curator of the American dream.
The seeds of change. The domestic doldrums were, ironically, the true birthplace of the change that would sweep through American culture. The profound, shared boredom of intelligent, educated women confined to the domestic sphere was generating an internal pressure cooker. In her moments of quiet reading and private writing, Eleanor was unconsciously connecting to a growing, collective realization. The problem is not with me. The problem is with the role. One rainy afternoon, as she sat reading a smuggled book on philosophy, she came across a passage that spoke of the necessity of self-actualization. She closed the book, her heart beating quickly. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window, the perfect hair, the manicured hand holding the illicit book. The woman in the glass looked composed, but the woman inside was a tangled mess of desire and denial. The search for identity had begun not with a grand rebellion, but with a quiet, desperate recognition of her own lost self. The boredom was no longer a personal failure, it was a societal indictment. And Eleanor, fueled by the quiet ache of her unused mind, was finally beginning to understand that to save her identity, she would have to challenge the very foundation of the perfect housewife ideal. The small treasons. The relentless mental toll of the domestic doldrums and the exhaustion of constant performance finally coalesced into action. Eleanor Atherton realized that a full-scale, public rejection of the perfect housewife ideal was impossible. It would risk her marriage, her social standing, and the financial security of her family. Instead, she began a campaign of small treasons, tiny, deliberate acts of nonconformity performed in the deepest privacy of her home, where the whispers of rebellion could not be overheard. These acts were not grand, they were microscopic adjustments to her daily uniform, designed to reclaim minute pieces of her comfort and her true identity. They were less about changing the world and more about saving herself. The undoing of the uniform. Eleanor's rebellion often began with the most restrictive elements of her beauty regimen and clothing. 1. The girdle gambit. This was her most consistent act of defiance. After George left for work, Eleanor would retreat to the bedroom and peel off her girdle. She would fold the tight, restricting garment and hide it under the bed, replacing it with a soft, comfortable cotton slip. The feeling of her stomach muscles relaxing, of being able to breathe deeply, was a physical release that translated into immediate mental clarity.
If the doorbell rang, she would quickly slip the girdle back on, enduring the brief, intense discomfort as the price of her freedom. 2. The hair's half-life. The meticulous hair setting was the most time-consuming of her duties. Eleanor began to shorten the time she spent under the dryer and lessen the amount of stiff hairspray she used. Her hair still looked generally set, but it had a subtle, natural movement that was absent in Evelyn Albright's stiff helmet of curls. It was a secret statement. My hair, at least, is not completely static. 3. The lipstick truce. For formal outings, the vibrant, dramatic lipstick was mandatory. But while alone in the house, Eleanor started leaving her lips entirely bare or using a simple, colorless lip balm. The absence of the thick, colored lacquer felt like removing the final seal of the mask, allowing her face to simply be. These small subversions were profoundly liberating. They were the private admissions that the prescribed perfection was neither necessary nor healthy. The sanctuary of unmade skin. One of Eleanor's most powerful acts of subversion involved the privacy of her complexion. The magazine mandate insisted that she wear foundation all day, every day. To be without it was to be bare, exposed, and morally suspect. However, after cleaning the house, Eleanor would often wash her face thoroughly, stripping away the heavy pancake foundation and the layer of concealing powder. For an hour or two in the late afternoon, she would simply exist with her own skin. Imperfections, natural color, and all. She looked at her reflection during these brief windows, noticing the fine lines around her eyes that the makeup was meant to erase. She began to see them not as flaws, but as evidence of a life lived, a silent documentation of her history. This sanctuary of unmade skin was a radical act of self-acceptance. It was the realization that the true purpose of the foundation was not beauty, but control, the control of her image. By removing it, she was asserting control over her own reality. The subversive comfort of work clothes. The most visible yet concealed act of rebellion involved clothing. She knew she could never wear trousers outside the yard, but for heavy cleaning tasks in the house, she began to deliberately choose George's old, comfortable attire. While scrubbing the baseboards or sorting the laundry in the basement, Eleanor would slip into a worn flannel shirt and a pair of George's discarded chinos. The fabric was soft, the movement was unrestricted, and the feeling was wonderfully, profoundly utilitarian. In these moments, she felt a powerful connection to the wartime Eleanor, the woman who had worked with a measurable purpose. The trousers were a temporary uniform of liberation. If a neighbor knocked, she would strip them off and pull on a dress with frantic speed. But the hours spent in the comfortable, practical clothes provided a psychological restorative that lasted long after the girdle was back in place. The private audience of the written word. Eleanor's greatest rebellion remained intellectual. Her secret notebook, hidden away, became the repository of her truth. In its pages, she challenged the domestic rules she followed every day. She wrote not about recipes or garden tips, but about the absurdity of the bridge club's hierarchy, the psychological mechanisms of the advertisements, and her own unfulfilled longing for a career. She started writing short, sharp, fictionalized vignettes about housewives who dared to speak their minds or leave their perfect homes. This writing was her most dangerous subversion. It was not a physical act, but an intellectual one, a refusal to allow her mind to be confined by the domestic doldrums. It was her private audience. It was the only place where she could drop the smile, shed the girdle, and allow the smart, cynical, and ambitious Eleanor to emerge, unfiltered and entirely her own. She was creating a counter-narrative to the one printed in the glossy magazines. The risk of discovery. The subversion, however, carried a constant risk. One afternoon, George came home unexpectedly early to retrieve a forgotten briefcase. Eleanor was on her knees, scrubbing the floor, wearing his old trousers and a sweat-stained shirt, her hair falling loosely around her shoulders. She had forgotten entirely the time and the necessity of her uniform. George stopped dead in the kitchen doorway. His face registered surprise, then confusion, and finally, a deep, quiet disappointment. "Eleanor?" he said, the flatness of his tone more damning than anger. "What on earth are you wearing? You look like you've been working in a coal mine." Eleanor scrambled to her feet, feeling a rush of shame that hit her with the force of a physical blow. She stammered an excuse about a particularly stubborn stain pulling the loose fabric around her. "Well, change out of those right now," George commanded, his gaze lingering on the trousers. "It's highly unsuitable. And fix your hair, please. It looks undone." The experience was a sharp reminder of the power structure. Her rebellion, however small, was visible, and visibility meant immediate suppression. She spent the rest of the evening subdued and obedient, but the fire of defiance had not been extinguished. It had simply been forced deeper underground.
Eleanor learned that the whispers of rebellion had to remain just that, whispers. The true freedom was not in the public act, but in the private knowledge that she was actively, continuously choosing to save a small piece of herself from the tyrannical demands of the perfect housewife ideal. The act of subverting the norms, even in private, was the first conscious step toward regaining her own identity. A new generation, a new code. The relentless conformity of the 1950s suburb had successfully created the perfect housewife, but in doing so, it had inadvertently incubated a silent revolution. The children raised in this environment of immaculate order and repressed emotion, the very children meant to inherit and perpetuate the suburban dream, were beginning to reject it. The middle of the decade marked the explosive rise of teen culture, and it brought with it the first powerful public challenge to mothers' standards. This new generation was the first with significant disposable income, and they created a culture entirely their own, defined by rebellion, music, and a deliberate disregard for the stiff formality their mothers represented. For Eleanor Afferton, this challenge was personified by her 13-year-old daughter, Susie, a girl who was rapidly outgrowing her starched, perfect pleated dresses and developing a disturbing preference for blue jeans and saddle shoes. The aesthetics of nonconformity. The teen rebellion was expressed primarily through aesthetics and direct inversion of the perfect housewife uniform, where Eleanor's aesthetic was defined by control, smoothness, and containment. The teen style celebrated exactly the opposite. The hair. Against the mother's sculpted, lacquered waves, the girls favored ponytails, loose, dynamic, and free to swing. For the boys, the slicked side part gave way to the messy, rebellious pompadour or the ducktail. The goal was movement, not immobility. The clothes. The restrictive girdle and full skirts were mocked by the teens' choice of tight, rebellious denim and casual, colorful shirts. The clothes were meant to be comfortable, functional, and slightly daring, a world away from the elegant confinement of the house dress. The music, most importantly, was the culture defined by rock and roll. The raw, untamed energy of Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry was the sonic antithesis of the polite orchestral music preferred by Eleanor and George. The music was loud, sexual, and fundamentally messy, a direct assault on the tranquility of the suburban living room. For Eleanor, the aesthetic was deeply unsettling. The teenager's deliberate sloppiness, the rolled-up sleeves, the untucked shirts, the casual footwear, felt like an insult to the immense labor she poured into her own appearance and home. It implied that her perfection was ridiculous, unnecessary, and perhaps even boring. Susie's small defiances. The conflict began quietly, focused on Susie's resistance to the mandatory uniform of youth. Eleanor insisted that Susie wear dresses to school and keep her hair neatly braided. Susie, however, used every opportunity to subvert these rules. The hemline war. Eleanor would let down Susie's skirt to the approved length just below the knee. Susie would covertly roll the waistband at school, creating a hemline that was shorter and more defiant. The denim demand. Susie's insistence on wearing jeans was the biggest source of friction. "They're what everyone wears, Mother. They're comfortable," she argued. For Eleanor, jeans represented low-class utility, not middle-class suburban polish. They signaled a disregard for the feminine delicacy she had worked so hard to embody. The makeup mutiny. While Eleanor used makeup to create a subtle, natural mask, Susie began experimenting with heavy, dark eyeliner and bright, shocking lipstick colors, a deliberate theatricality meant to shock her mother's generation. "Why must you look so extreme?" Eleanor would ask, genuinely confused by the desire to look anything other than poised. Susie, inheriting her mother's suppressed frustration, would retort, "Because I don't want to look like I'm sitting around waiting for the milkman to deliver groceries, Mother. I want to look alive." The word alive cut Eleanor deeply. It suggested that her own life, defined by its flawless aesthetic, was synonymous with being dead. The generational gap in values. The aesthetic challenge reflected a fundamental gap in values. Eleanor's generation valued security, sacrifice, and conformity. Susie's generation valued authenticity, freedom, and self-expression. When George criticized the loud music coming from Susie's bedroom, the distorted guitars and primal beat, it wasn't just about noise, it was about the threat of disorder. "It's simply unsettling, Eleanor," he would complain. "It sounds like chaos. It's not respectable." To George, the music represented the loss of control, the very chaos he had spent his post-war career fighting to contain. But to Susie, the chaos was the antidote to the rigid, suffocating order of Pinecrest Hills. Eleanor found herself caught between two worlds. Her primary duty was to enforce mother's standards, to shape Susie into the next generation's dutiful, polished woman. Yet when she looked at the joy on Susie's face while she danced wildly to a rock and roll record, free of the constraints Eleanor herself felt, a part of her felt a pang of envy. The teenagers were doing publicly what Eleanor only dared to do in her secret utility closet, reclaim their bodies and their desires. The breakdown of the ritual. The ultimate threat of teen culture was its disruption of Eleanor's meticulously planned domestic and aesthetic rituals. Disorder. Susie's room was a continuous zone of acceptable mess. Unmade bed, clothes strewn about, records and magazines scattered about. This violated the fundamental rule of the perfect housewife, that every space must be controlled. Disruption. Teenagers' spontaneity, their late-night phone calls, their sudden insistence on driving to a diner, shattered the predictable schedule that Eleanor relied on to maintain her equilibrium and her image. Disrespect. The aesthetic choices were often made specifically to annoy the older generation. It was a conscious rejection of their values, and therefore a direct challenge to Eleanor's authority and life choices. The suburban dream was built on the foundation of the nuclear family's perfect image, and the teenagers were intentionally, audibly, and visibly undermining that foundation. A whisper of understanding. One day, Eleanor watched Susie struggle to perfectly slick back her hair into a smooth, high ponytail. After several failed attempts, Susie threw the brush down in frustration. "It's impossible," Susie exclaimed. "It always has to be perfect. You have to be so careful with everything." In that moment, Eleanor saw not a rebellious teenager, but her own reflection 30 years earlier, a girl trapped by impossible standards. She walked over to Susie and gently picked up the brush. "It doesn't have to be perfect, dear," Eleanor said softly, a phrase she rarely allowed herself to voice. She didn't tell Susie to use less hairspray. Instead, she showed her a slightly looser, more natural way to gather the hair, allowing a few wisps to frame her face, a style that still looked tidy but felt less like a cage. In this small, shared moment, Eleanor realized that the challenge to Mother's standards was not an attack. It was a desperate plea for authenticity that her own generation had been too afraid to utter. The teenage aesthetic, with its raw energy and open defiance, was providing the first public crack in the flawless facade of the perfect housewife, suggesting that perhaps the silent struggles of the mothers were not inevitable after all.
The illusion of choice. The booming post-war economy was underpinned by the housewife's wallet. She was the family's designated purchasing agent, controlling over 75% of the household budget. Advertisements didn't just tell Eleanor Atherton what to buy. They presented the act of buying as a form of empowerment. The endless array of products, from wrinkle creams to automatic washing machines, promised not just convenience, but a subtle kind of freedom. This was the core of consumerism's paradox, the belief that the perfect life and even personal autonomy could be bought. Women were told that by purchasing the right products, they were investing in efficiency, health, and modernity, thus freeing up time for self-improvement and leisure. The reality for Eleanor, however, was that every purchase was a new chain, binding her more tightly to the aesthetic and domestic standard she was struggling to escape. The myth of efficiency. The most insidious promise of consumerism was the myth of efficiency. Eleanor's kitchen was full of labor-saving devices: the electric mixer, the automatic dishwasher, the new high-powered vacuum cleaner. Each one was sold with the promise that it would liberate her from drudgery. But the appliances did not free up time. They merely elevated the standard of required perfection. The washing machine meant Eleanor had to ensure every single item of George's white shirts was flawlessly brilliant, eliminating the slight yellowing that was once acceptable. The electric mixer meant she was expected to produce more elaborate and varied baked goods, turning a simple cake into a multi-layered dessert. The vacuum cleaner meant the house had to be vacuumed every single day, not just twice a week, because the tool made the task so easy. The time saved was immediately consumed by the increased pressure to meet the new, impossible aesthetic benchmark. Eleanor was running faster just to stay in the same place of domestic labor. The false promise of transformation. The paradox was most acutely felt in the beauty aisle. The advertisements promised that products offered a magical transformation, a path to the confident, elegant woman she aspired to be. Eleanor would look at a jar of expensive night cream and see not just skin care, but a promise of perpetual youth and security. The ad copy suggested that this cream would not only erase her wrinkles, but also erase her worries, ensuring her husband's unwavering affection. She bought the newest, sleekest Revlon lipstick, convinced that its bold color would somehow imbue her with the daring, unconstrained spirit of the model in the magazine. The reality was always disappointing. The cream might smooth her skin, but it didn't touch the loneliness in her mind. The lipstick made her mouth look perfect, but it felt like a heavy, professional barrier, not an expression of her own liberated self. The products were merely sophisticated tools for maintaining the mask, not keys to unlock her inner freedom. The debt to the ideal. Every dollar spent on these necessary items, from the new apron to the hairspray, created a deeper debt to the ideal. Eleanor had to justify the expenditures to George, subtly framing them as investments in his own status. This new detergent is much better for the silver. It keeps the shine perfect for your bosses.
I needed this new foundation because the old one was getting too dark for winter. I must look proper for your clients. Her spending was inextricably tied to the maintenance of his public image. The more she bought, the more she relied on George's income, and the more dependent she became on the very system that confined her. The money she spent on her freedom products was simply money exchanged for a tighter leash. This transactional relationship, beauty for security, was the most corrosive element of the paradox. She was forced to commodify her own body and image, perpetually renewing her lease on the suburban dream by keeping up with the relentless cycle of consumer expectations. The rebellion of the cheapskates. Eleanor's growing awareness of this paradox led to new, subtle acts of rebellion tied to her consumption habits. She started experimenting with not buying the most expensive, heavily advertised brands. She started mixing her own homemade furniture polish, using lemon oil and vinegar, finding a simple, practical satisfaction in the process. She avoided the prepackaged cake mixes, which were expensive and contained unnecessary chemicals, returning to the less convenient but more satisfying process of baking from scratch. These choices were her way of reclaiming her power as a purchasing agent. By rejecting the advertised convenience and choosing utility or tradition, she was quietly rejecting the consumer narrative that defined her. This small shift gave her a sense of authenticity that no prepackaged beauty product ever could. A new definition of freedom. One late afternoon, Eleanor was in the utility closet, hiding her worn, comfortable slippers before George came home. She looked at the shelf, filled with the countless cans, jars, and bottles, the arsenal of the perfect housewife. The high-end skin cream sat next to the cheap, generic dish soap. The expensive, specialized stain remover sat next to a plain bar of laundry soap. All of it was purchased in the pursuit of perfection and the promise of a better life. She picked up the box of expensive, highly advertised reducing wafers, the symbol of her futile attempt to buy the ideal figure. She didn't eat one. She simply held the box, felt its weight, and then, with a clear, deliberate resolve she had rarely allowed herself, she walked over to the trash can and dropped the entire unused box inside. It was a small act, but it was significant. It was the rejection of a false promise. She was choosing to accept her own discomfort, her own body, and her own difficult reality, rather than pay the continuous financial and psychological tax for the illusion of commercial ease. Eleanor realized that freedom would never be found in a bottle, a box, or an appliance. It would be found only in the conscious internal rejection of the consumer mandate. She had to stop buying the lie. The cost of perfection was simply too high, and the only path to true liberation was through denial, not of food, but of the ceaseless demand to consume and conform. The beautiful, polished world of the 1950s suburb was a golden prison, and Eleanor knew that to truly escape, she had to stop purchasing the materials used to build its walls. The chronology of self-maintenance. The vast majority of a perfect housewife's day was accounted for in tangible domestic tasks, cleaning the kitchen, vacuuming the rugs, preparing meals. Yet layered beneath these duties was an equally demanding, utterly undocumented job, the continuous, unseen labor of personal aesthetic maintenance. This labor was invisible because it was performed in private, dismissed as vanity, and never factored into the concept of a woman's workday. For Eleanor Atherton, this effort consumed approximately 3 hours of her waking life every day, time that was stolen from rest, self-improvement, or leisure.
This meticulous time commitment was necessary because the look was not a static state. It was a complex system requiring constant input. To maintain the illusion of being perpetually rested and effortlessly elegant, Eleanor had to engage in a rigorous chronology of self-maintenance that began before dawn. Eleanor's day officially began at 5 a.m., a time when George and the children were still deep in sleep. Her first hour was entirely dedicated to preemptive aesthetic defense.
1. The roller removal ritual. 15 minutes. The rigid, uncomfortable plastic rollers had to be carefully unwound from her hair. This had to be done gently to ensure the curl remained intact. The hair was then lightly brushed and aggressively sprayed with lacquer, the final hardening agent for the day. This preparation had to be completed before the children woke, as the sight of their mother in rollers was deemed inappropriate and unprofessional. 2. The foundation mask. 25 minutes. This was the longest, most crucial part of the morning. The heavy, matte foundation had to be applied evenly, blended seamlessly down the neck, and then set with a thick layer of powder. Every visible flaw, the dark circles from insomnia, the stress lines, the subtle redness from harsh soap, had to be perfectly erased. This application was a psychological act. By putting on the mask, Eleanor assumed the identity of the calm, capable woman she was required to be. 3. The dress and fasteners. 20 minutes. Putting on the invisible uniform was a struggle. The girdle had to be worked up and hooked tightly, the structured bra positioned. The petticoats had to be carefully arranged beneath the starched dress to achieve the correct volume. This effort was physically taxing and restrictive, yet vital. The woman had to be built before she could run the household. By 6 a.m., Eleanor was already physically tired, but aesthetically flawless, ready to start the visible domestic labor of making breakfast. The bulk of the day's domestic labor, scrubbing, cooking, lifting, threatened to dismantle the morning's careful work. The kitchen's heat was the primary saboteur. To combat this, Eleanor scheduled multiple quick touch-ups throughout her day. Lipstick checks, continuous. Every sip of coffee, every bite of the children's leftovers, and every nervous moment required a trip to the hall mirror to check the shell-pink curve. The slightest fade in lipstick was a sign of slipping control. The hair check. After intense periods of cooking or cleaning, Eleanor would discreetly pat her hair to check for humidity-induced wilting. A quick covert spritz of hairspray was sometimes deployed in the quiet of the utility closet, a burst of chemical control over nature. The manicure maintenance. Despite wearing gloves for dishwashing, the nail still required continuous maintenance. A broken nail or chipped polish was a disaster, requiring immediate, precise repair, a process that took valuable time away from other tasks simply to uphold the illusion of delicate, unused hands. These small, constant acts of maintenance punctuated her day, breaking the flow of domestic work and requiring her to constantly switch roles from laborer to aesthetic sentinel. The time lost to these micro-rituals was substantial, but never counted as work. This was the most pressurized period of the unseen labor, the race to achieve peak perfection just before George's arrival. The goal was a total appearance reset. 1. The foundation reevaluation. 10 minutes. By late afternoon, the original makeup often looked tired or patchy. Eleanor had to either perfectly blend and refresh the existing layer, or, more often, quickly wash and reapply key areas. This required speed and precision, often performed while the dinner was simmering on the stove. 2. The change of clothes. 10 minutes. The house dress worn for cleaning was swiftly discarded.
often hiding a sweat stain or a cooking splatter, and replaced with a fresh, evening-appropriate version, a slightly nicer cotton print, or a dress with a crisper collar. This change, while purely aesthetic, was essential for the husband's perception of a fresh, serene welcome. 3. The final accessory check, 10 minutes. This included ensuring the pearl earrings were clipped correctly, the seam of her stockings was perfectly straight, a visible run was a public failure, and her perfume was reapplied, the final ethereal touch of feminine grace. The frantic pace of this half hour created immense stress. She had to transition instantly from the reality of her day, the fatigue, the mess, the labor, to the facade of the woman George expected to see. The psychological cost of undocumented time. The true cost of this unseen labor was the psychological depletion caused by the constant need to track and manage time. Eleanor lived with a pervasive, internalized timer, always calculating how long until I need to touch up my face, how much time before George is home, how long before the children ruin this new dress. This lack of genuine leisure time was paralyzing. If she sat down to read a book, she knew that time was stolen from the next touch-up or the next cleaning task. This made true relaxation impossible. The culture had successfully convinced her that the time spent on her appearance was not work, but a necessary feminine pursuit, a source of pride. Yet Eleanor knew, deep down, that she was laboring for 3 hours a day on an aesthetic performance, and the sheer effort made the promise of effortless beauty a cruel joke. The silent overtime. The unseen labor did not end when George went to bed. It simply shifted into a silent, solitary phase. Silent overtime. The hair setting, 30 minutes. Every night, the entire structure had to be deconstructed and immediately rebuilt. The rollers had to be tightly wrapped, secured, and protected by the hairnet, ensuring the style would survive the night for the morning's performance. The maintenance meticulousness. This was the time for applying heavy night creams, checking the manicure, and performing any necessary mending or spot cleaning of her clothing that could not wait until morning. As Eleanor stood in front of the mirror late at night, exhausted, her hands aching from the precise work of rolling her hair, she saw the reality behind the illusion. The look was not a gift of nature. It was a tireless, repetitive, and incredibly time-consuming manufacturing process. The total time and effort of maintaining the look amounted to a second, hidden job, a job with impossible standards, zero pay, and no holidays. This realization was the sharp, clarifying truth of her life. The price of being the perfect housewife was not just her identity, but the complete forfeiture of her own time, energy, and freedom. She was always on the clock, performing an unseen labor that kept the American dream running one hairspray application at a time. The exclusivity of perfection. The perfect housewife ideal, as meticulously constructed by the advertising agencies and women's magazines, was never intended to be universal. It was a standard built on the bedrock of exclusivity, implicitly and explicitly available only to a specific demographic: white, affluent, suburban, middle to upper class women. The image of Eleanor Atherton, immaculately dressed, presiding over a gleaming, appliance-filled home, was a status symbol that inherently excluded vast swaths of the American female population based on both race and class. For Eleanor, the aesthetic was a burden of compliance. For many others, it was an impossibility enforced by economic and systemic barriers. The question was not who wanted the perfect ideal, but who could afford it. The economic barrier, the working-class wife. The most immediate barrier was economic. The perfect housewife look, with its requirement for daily fresh clothing, expensive cosmetics, and high-maintenance hair, was fundamentally incompatible with the reality of the working-class wife. A woman whose husband worked in a factory or drove a truck often had to manage a tighter budget, forcing her to make practical choices over aesthetic ones. Clothes versus utility. The working-class wife prioritized durability over fashionable polish. Her clothes were often less structured, made of sturdier materials that could withstand manual cleaning and frequent mending. Her shoes were flat and practical, designed for long hours on her feet, not for the delicate glide required by heels. The unseen labor tax. She could not afford the 3 hours of unseen labor that Eleanor devoted to her appearance. Time was money, and her time was often spent supplementing the family income through part-time work in factories, laundries, or as domestic help, or by making everything from scratch, sewing clothes, baking bread, rather than purchasing time-saving but expensive commercial products. The appliance gap. The gleaming white appliances that symbolized Eleanor's modernity were simply out of reach. The working-class kitchen often relied on older, less efficient equipment, meaning the labor was genuinely hard labor, not just the aesthetic management of a modern showroom. For these women, the magazines were not sacred texts, they were aspirational fantasies. The pressure was not to achieve the ideal, but to achieve a basic level of cleanliness and respectability that was far closer to the Depression-era survival ethic than the affluent suburban polish. The racial divide, the excluded image. The beauty ideal was particularly cruel to women of color, especially African American women, for whom the standard was not only economically difficult, but also racially unattainable. The fundamental aesthetic premise of the perfect housewife was based on whiteness, the promotion of pale, matte foundation, soft, light-colored hair, and the suppression of any physical features deemed ethnic. The hair mandate. For African American women, achieving the smooth, controlled European-style waves or flips required a costly and time-consuming process of chemical straightening or relaxing. This was not a choice of vanity. It was often a prerequisite for professional employment and social acceptance in a deeply segregated society. The cost of chemical treatments and specialized hair care products represented a significant financial burden not faced by white women like Eleanor. The skin tone. The foundation advertised to mask flaws was tailored for light skin, often leaving women of color struggling to find suitable shades, reinforcing the message that their natural skin tone was undesirable. The domestic worker paradox. The very women who often performed the heavy physical labor that kept the white suburban homes immaculate and allowed women like Eleanor to maintain their effortless look were frequently women of color. The maid or housekeeper was the living, breathing proof that the perfect housewife was an illusion supported by the exploitation of another woman's labor. The African American middle class, while striving for respectability, often created their own aesthetic standards, focused on sharp tailoring, meticulous grooming, and a fierce dedication to cleanliness as a defense against racial stereotypes. However, this aesthetic was pursued not to emulate the housewife ideal, but to assert dignity in the face of systemic racism. Eleanor's limited view. Eleanor, insulated by the homogeneous environment of Pine Knoll Heights, rarely confronted these realities directly. Her world was a monochromatic bubble where poverty and racial difference were abstract concepts that existed only in distant news reports. Her exposure to the racial divide was limited to the occasional presence of a cleaner or cook hired by the richer families on her street, women who, despite performing far harder domestic labor than Eleanor, were instantly judged by their employers and neighbors if their own appearance deviated from the standards of middle-class polish. Eleanor remembered Evelyn Albright discussing her new cleaning lady with thinly veiled disdain.
She's a good worker, but I had to tell her about her uniform. She kept wearing those trousers. It simply doesn't look right when guests come over. It undermines the whole tone of the house." The comment illuminated the cruel hierarchy. The domestic worker was expected to project an image of servitude, the clean but plain uniform, while the lady of the house projected an image of leisure, the immaculate dress and pearls. The inherent injustice. The perfect housewife ideal, therefore, was not merely an aesthetic standard. It was a potent tool of social stratification. It reassured the white middle class that their economic prosperity was reflected in their domestic sphere. It provided a constant aspirational target for the lower middle class, encouraging them to spend their limited resources on products to bridge the gap. It enforced a brutal, unattainable standard of whiteness and leisure that marginalized women of color and women forced into the labor market. Eleanor's journey of questioning the ideal began with her own boredom and fatigue. The next inevitable step was the realization that the system that constrained her was also fundamentally unjust, a massive, systemic illusion that forced one group to perform effortless elegance at the expense of another group's literal, exhausting labor. Her unseen labor was immense, but it was still performed within a well-heated, well-equipped home. The labor of the women outside her class and race was far harder, far dirtier, and utterly devoid of the cultural validation she received for her own difficult performance. The recognition of this vast inherent inequality made the burden of her own perfect image feel simultaneously lighter and infinitely more shameful. The ideal was beautiful, yes, but its beauty was paid for by the exclusion and exploitation of millions. The collective unhappiness. The profound psychological and aesthetic pressures placed upon the perfect housewife by the 1950s ideal were experienced by millions of women like Eleanor Atherton. This widespread yet silent despair was not just individual frustration. It was a societal symptom that sociologists and intellectuals would later term the problem that has no name. The feeling of being trapped, bored, and unfulfilled, despite having achieved the American dream, was the collective emotional fuel that would eventually ignite a political movement. Eleanor's private rebellion, the hidden trousers, the bare face, the secret notebooks, were reflections of this larger cultural phenomenon. She was an isolated figure, but her dissatisfaction was a universal tremor. And it was in the intellectual ferment and the tentative reaching out between women that the seeds of second-wave feminism began to be sown.
The informal networks of discontent. In the early years of the dissatisfaction, the late 1950s and early 1960s, organized feminist activity was still nascent. The activism began in subtle, informal ways, primarily through networks of discontent. Eleanor and her neighbors, despite their fierce competition over perfect appearances, often engaged in conversations that hinted at their shared struggle. These were usually veiled, but the underlying message was clear. We are exhausted. The book club as a forum. The suburban book club, ostensibly a social activity, became an unintentional intellectual forum. While they were meant to discuss light, approved fiction, women sometimes steered the conversation toward challenging authors, or more daringly, to nonfiction works that critiqued the domestic sphere. Eleanor, risking judgment, once brought up a discussion of Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, which she had sourced from a city bookstore, only to have the other women quickly dismiss it as too gloomy. Yet the idea had been planted. The shared secret of tranquilizers. The high rate of prescription tranquilizers, like Miltown or Valium,
often referred to as mother's little helpers, among suburban women was an undeniable sign of mass unhappiness. When Eleanor and Evelyn Albright shared a quiet moment at a picnic, the subtle, knowing glance exchanged when discussing a headache was a silent acknowledgement of the pills they relied on. The dependence on medication was the medical confirmation that the perfect housewife role was fundamentally sickening. These subtle signals created a foundation of shared understanding, a quiet realization that their problems were social, not personal. The intellectual spark, the call for education. The most powerful seed of activism came from the academic world. Many of the perfect housewives were college-educated women who had been pulled from or dissuaded from careers. Their unused intelligence became the primary driver of their boredom and despair. Eleanor's yearning to return to college, or simply to engage in meaningful, structured intellectual work, was not unique. This led to the formation of adult education programs aimed at women seeking to refresh their skills or complete degrees. While George saw Eleanor's occasional enrollment in a local evening course as a cute hobby to keep her busy, it was in fact a radical act of self-reclamation. These classes, in literature, history, or even early computer programming, became the first safe spaces where housewives could articulate their identity outside of their domestic roles. In these classrooms, women found their voice, and more importantly, they found each other, realizing that their discontent was systemic. The written word of revolution. The true catalyst that transformed private misery into public discourse was the emerging critical literature of the early 1960s. The definitive spark for the second wave came with the publication of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, 1963. Though the year of the book's publication falls slightly later than the strictest 1950s time frame, the ideas that Friedan articulated were developed throughout the previous decade based on interviews and observations of women like Eleanor. Eleanor finally obtained a copy of the book through a discreet friend in the city. She read it locked in her bathroom, hiding it beneath the towels. As she read Friedan's words describing the unnamed problem, the stifling pressure, and the sense of isolation, Eleanor felt a shock of profound recognition. The book named her pain, the feminine mystique, the myth that a woman's fulfillment rested exclusively within the domestic sphere. Friedan validated Eleanor's most rebellious secret thoughts. I am not crazy. I am not ungrateful. The role itself is flawed. The reading was a moment of absolute clarity, instantly transforming her private struggle into a political issue. The destruction of the perfection ideal was now a righteous cause, not a personal failing. The quiet commitment. Eleanor realized she was living through the first stirrings of a historical moment. Her small, secretive acts of rebellion gained immense meaning. Her refusal to wear her girdle one day, her intellectual writing in her hidden notebook, these were not just coping mechanisms, they were the quiet commitment to a larger movement. She knew she couldn't join a march or start a public organization, but she could raise her daughter differently, encouraging Susie's intellectual curiosity and her desire for independence rather than suppressing it. Support the network, discreetly sharing information, lending books, and validating the feelings of other women who dared to whisper their discontent. Stop the lie, refusing to pretend to George that her life was entirely fulfilling, forcing small, incremental confrontations about her need for time and purpose. The seeds of second-wave feminism were sown not in the streets, but in the sterile quiet of suburban homes, watered by the tears of women who were tired of performing the effortless lie. Eleanor's silent struggle was over. It was replaced by a quiet, determined commitment to the eventual dismantling of the perfect housewife ideal. The aesthetic battles were merely skirmishes. The real war was for the right to define one's own existence. The fissure in the foundation. By the early 1960s, the flawless, static image of the perfect housewife was no longer merely a burden, it was a relic. The silent struggles of women like Eleanor Atherton, combined with the external turbulence of emerging teen culture and nascent feminist thought, were creating a deep fissure in the foundation of the suburban dream. The sun, though still bright over Pine Knoll Heights, was setting on the rigid aesthetic and emotional standards of the previous decade. The question was not if the ideal would shatter, but when and how fast the fragments would fly. This realization, the understanding of the ideal's inevitable sunset, was dawning slowly on Eleanor. She could feel the tectonic shifts in the culture, most tangibly through the changing face of fashion and the increasing assertiveness of the younger generation. The era of controlled perfection was giving way to a new era defined by fluidity and self-expression. The changing face of fashion. Fashion, the most public barometer of cultural values, was the first to declare the perfect image obsolete. The change was swift and brutal, abandoning the architectural confines of the 1950s silhouette. 1. The end of the fasteners. The tight, restrictive girdles and rigid conical bras suddenly appeared old-fashioned. The new clothing styles demanded less structure. The silhouette loosened, allowing the body more natural movement. This change, driven by designers reacting to the demands of younger women, was a massive, silent physical liberation for Eleanor's generation. The abandonment of the girdle was not just a style change, it was a political statement of personal comfort. 2. The rise of the A-line and shift dress. The full, petticoat-supported skirt gave way to the sleek, simple A-line and shift dress. These garments required far less underlying structure and far less ironing and maintenance. For Eleanor, the simple act of choosing a shift dress meant reclaiming 30 minutes of ironing and a full hour of freedom from the physical discomfort of the corset. The new styles implicitly challenged the idea that a woman's body needed to be constantly managed and physically restrained to be desirable. 3. The hair revolution. The most dramatic shift was in hair. The advent of the bouffant, which while large was softer and less stiff than the 50s wave, and later the short easy cut, like the Vidal-Sassoon style, signified the end of the mandatory overnight setting ritual. Hair was now supposed to look full, but move. For Eleanor, this meant she could cut her own hair shorter, reducing her 3 hours of unseen labor dramatically, and achieving a lightness she hadn't felt in years. Eleanor watched her neighbor, Evelyn Albright, struggle to adapt. Evelyn clung stubbornly to her stiff, sprayed waves and her tight, starched dresses, looking increasingly out of step, like a museum exhibit in a fast-moving world. The former aesthetic queen was now a prisoner of her own outdated perfection. The media's divided message. The media, always keen to capitalize on the next trend, began sending a confusing, divided message. The older magazines still sold the domestic dream, but the new advertising targeted the liberated youth. The new ideal. Advertisements began featuring models who were younger, thinner, and less smiling. Their poses were casual, their makeup was often bolder and less focused on naturalism, e.g., the heavy eyeliner of the mod look. The focus shifted from being the perfect wife to being the fashionable, modern individual. The consumer trap evolved. Women were now encouraged to buy products that symbolized spontaneity and youthfulness. Eleanor realized she was still being sold an identity, but at least the new identity required less physical pain and less time spent in domestic ritual. Eleanor began to experiment cautiously. She replaced her shell-pink lipstick with a lighter gloss and traded her heavy foundation for a tinted moisturizer. The difference was immediate. She looked fresher, younger, and felt physically lighter, realizing how much the 1950s mask had weighed on her. Susie's liberation and Eleanor's envy. Eleanor's daughter, Susie, was growing into this cultural moment, experiencing a freedom her mother never had. Susie wore her hair loose, dressed in clothes that allowed her to run and dance, and voiced her opinions, even her disagreements with George, without fear of social consequence. Watching Susie, Eleanor felt a complicated mix of pride and a profound, aching envy. The younger generation was simply acting the life Eleanor had only dared to write about in her private journal. This generational shift provided Eleanor with the crucial permission she needed to relax her standards. If the world was moving toward casualness, her rigid perfection was no longer a sign of social responsibility. It was a sign of being stuck. The standards were becoming negotiable. The inevitability of chaos. The deepest realization of the inevitable sunset was that chaos was coming and it could not be stopped. The tightly controlled, emotionally repressed, and aesthetically rigid world George and Eleanor had built was fundamentally unstable. Social chaos. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum. Student protests were beginning, and the concept of unquestioning authority was eroding. The external world was becoming politically and socially messy. Aesthetic chaos. The music, the art, and the fashion were all breaking boundaries. The simple, predictable comfort of the 1950s was being replaced by the complex, demanding realities of the 1960s. Eleanor understood that her personal performance, the flawless hair, the spotless home, was an attempt to hold back a cultural tide. It was an act of personal defiance against the impending disorder. But she was exhausted, and the tide was too strong. One morning, Eleanor left her bed, and instead of going straight to her rollers and foundation, she walked to the kitchen and put on the percolator. She looked at the mirror and saw the tired lines around her eyes, the natural color of her lips, and the slightly rumpled state of her hair. She didn't rush to fix it. She sat down and drank her coffee, listening to the silence of the early morning. She decided in that moment that the rigid schedule of the perfect image was done. She would still be clean and presentable for George, but the frantic 3-hour ritual of perfection would cease. She would allow her face to look tired, her clothes to be comfortable, and her time to be her own. The sunset was not an ending, it was a profound release. The beautiful, suffocating image was fading, and in its place was the messy, complicated, but infinitely more real possibility of Eleanor. She realized that the greatest freedom was not buying freedom, but simply taking it back, one unlacquered hair strand and one ungirdled breath at a time. The battle was won not with an explosion, but with a quiet, decisive surrender to her own reality. The enduring shadow of perfection. By the mid-1960s, the physical manifestations of the perfect housewife ideal, the tight girdles, the lacquered hair, the 3-hour ritual, were largely discarded by Eleanor Ayrton and the new generation. The sunset had passed. However, the true end of the era was not marked by a change in fashion, but by the slow realization that the legacy of layers was psychological and systemic, not merely aesthetic. The 1950s beauty standard did not vanish, it simply went underground, leaving a profound and lasting impact on how American women relate to their bodies, their labor, and their identity. The aesthetic norms of the 1950s left behind a shadow that shaped the next half-century of beauty culture, creating both deeply ingrained anxieties and unexpected lessons in resilience. The myth of effortlessness. The most enduring and insidious legacy of the 1950s was the myth of effortlessness. Eleanor's generation was required to conceal their unseen labor, making hours of work look like innate grace. This mandate did not die, it merely mutated. In the decades that followed, women were expected to be successful professionals, active mothers, and devoted partners, all while maintaining a flawless appearance that suggested they had boundless time and energy.
The 1980s working woman, she traded the house dress for the power suit, but the expectation of perfection remained. She had to look polished and ready for the boardroom while still managing a household, a double burden now enforced in both the private and public spheres. The modern aesthetic. Today, the no-makeup makeup look is the direct descendant of the 1950s foundation mask. It requires a lengthy ritual using expensive products to achieve an appearance that suggests no effort was made at all. The lie remains the same. The most desirable state is one that perfectly conceals the labor of its own maintenance. Eleanor recognized this dynamic in her daughter, Susie, who, in her 20s, often complained about the pressure to look naturally beautiful while spending large sums on gym memberships and elaborate skincare routines. The financial cost of perfection had changed, but the obligation to hide the effort remained a cruel tax. The internalized scrutiny and shame. The constant societal judgment and neighborhood watch of the suburbs became an internalized scrutiny within the minds of women. Eleanor's fear of Mrs. Albright's critical eye became her own self-criticism. The deep-seated connection between weight, beauty, and moral worth established by the tyranny of the ideal silhouette persisted. The relentless cycle of diet and denial became institutionalized in a multi-billion-dollar diet industry. The 1950s defined the shame, the subsequent decades capitalized on it. Eleanor often reflected that the true psychological wound of her generation was being taught that her natural state, unmade, ungirdled, and unrested, was fundamentally unacceptable. This foundational self-contempt became a chronic ailment for many women, passed down through subtle cues and anxieties. The legacy of the kitchen crisis, double duty. The kitchen crisis, the demand to perform physical labor while maintaining an impractical aesthetic, evolved into the modern problem of double duty. Eleanor's generation had to manage the home and look perfect. Later generations had to manage a career, the home, and still look perfect. The 1950s successfully cemented the idea that a woman's appearance was her responsibility and her labor was invisible. This legacy meant that even as women gained professional equality, the burden of aesthetic perfection remained theirs alone, rarely shared by men. George could arrive home exhausted and unshaven. Eleanor could not. That expectation, born in the post-war era, remains stubbornly intact. However, the legacy was not entirely negative. The struggle against the oppressive 1950s ideal unintentionally fostered a profound sense of resilience and provided the essential playbook for future activism. 1. The recognition of systemic flaw. The widespread misery of the perfect housewife became the critical evidence that fueled second-wave feminism. The system broke the women, but in breaking them, it revealed its fatal flaw, giving Friedan and others the proof they needed. The silent struggles of the 1950s became the powerful voices of the 1960s and 70s. 2. The value of utility and comfort. Eleanor's whispers of rebellion, her preference for comfortable trousers and unconstricting clothes, planted the seed for a future where fashion prioritized comfort and functionality. The fight for the right to wear trousers was won on the domestic front, where the girdle was first discarded.
3. The power of female networks. The informal networks of discontent, the secret sharing of books and experiences, taught women the profound power of shared vulnerability. The realization that the problem has no name was quickly followed by the collective discovery that we are not alone. Eleanor's final reflection. Decades later, Eleanor, now in her late 70s, watched a television interview with a young feminist discussing the pressures of modern beauty standards. The young woman spoke of airbrushing, social media filters, and the demand to hide any sign of aging or imperfection. Eleanor smiled faintly. The specific tools had changed, but the fundamental pressure remained the same. The demand to perform an unattainable, commercialized ideal. She looked down at her hands. They were spotted with age, the nails neatly but plainly filed. Her white hair was short and soft, requiring only 5 minutes of care each morning. She wore comfortable, loose-fitting clothes. She was entirely unmade, and she was utterly, finally free. The perfect housewife ideal was a magnificent, beautiful lie, built on layers of makeup, rigid garments, and suppressed emotion. Its legacy of layers continues to shape the world, but Eleanor's hard-won wisdom was simple. The true revolutionary act is not to achieve the aesthetic standard, but to recognize the lie, step out of the layers, and claim the right to one's own messy, imperfect, and genuine self. The silent struggles of the 1950s were not a failure. They were the essential, painful prelude to every modern woman's fight for authenticity. The perfection was the image, the struggle was the inheritance.